At my Sunday breakfast, my daughter-in-law demanded the deed to my lake house in front of my 7-year-old granddaughter. When I refused, she slapped me so hard my hearing aid flew across the floor. I made 2 phone calls. 36 minutes later, a woman walked up my porch steps, and when my son saw who it was, he started to cry. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Corey Rollins. I am 69 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer designing bridges that could withstand the most brutal hurricanes hitting the coast. I spent my life understanding stress points, load-bearing walls, and exactly how much pressure a foundation can take before it cracks. But nothing in my decades of calculating structural integrity could have prepared me for the sudden violent collapse of my own family that Sunday morning. It started like any other weekend. The morning sun was pouring through the kitchen windows of the home my late wife Naomi and I had built together. I was at the stove humming an old Motown tune, flipping pancakes and stirring a pot of grits. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. It was supposed to be a peaceful family breakfast. My son Kendall, who is 35, had come over with his 32-year-old wife Courtney and my beautiful 7-year-old granddaughter Layla. Layla was sitting at the kitchen island happily coloring in her book, her little legs kicking back and forth. She was the absolute light of my life, the one piece of pure joy I had left since Naomi passed away 5 years ago. I set the plates down on the large oak table. Kendall sat quietly staring intently at his phone as he always did while Courtney barely touched her food. Courtney had always carried herself with a bizarre sense of superiority. As a white woman who grew up with money she never had to earn, she was obsessed with curating a fake high society lifestyle, constantly trying to impress her wealthy friends while turning her nose up at the hardworking roots Kendall came from. She tolerated me at best, usually viewing me as a relic of a past she wanted her husband to erase. I was just pouring myself a cup of black coffee when Courtney abruptly pushed her plate aside. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and slammed them directly onto the center of the kitchen table right next to the syrup and butter. "Sign these, Corey," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying the tone of a boss giving an order to an employee, not a daughter-in-law speaking to her husband's father. I put down my coffee mug and looked at the papers. The bold letters at the top made my stomach tighten. It was the deed to the lake house. The small, beautiful cabin Naomi and I had saved up for years to buy. It was our sanctuary, the place where we spent our summers, the place where I still went to feel close to her memory. "What is this, Courtney?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly level. "It is the transfer of the deed," she replied, tapping her manicured acrylic nail against the signature line. "Kendall and I need collateral. I am opening a luxury fashion boutique downtown, and the bank needs a hard asset to secure the commercial loan. Since you barely even use the lake house anyway, we are going to leverage it. It is just sitting there collecting dust. We need the capital now." I looked at the documents, then at Courtney's entitled, expectant face. She did not ask. She did not present a business plan. She simply demanded the only physical piece of my wife's memory I had left, all to fund a vanity project, so she could play pretend with her elite friends. "No," I said quietly. I picked up the stack of papers and calmly slid them back across the table toward her. "I am not signing over my home for a boutique." The single word hung in the air. For a moment, the kitchen was completely silent, save for the scratching of Layla's crayons. Courtney's jaw dropped. A flush of angry red crept up her neck and settled into her cheeks. She looked at Kendall, expecting him to intervene to force my hand. But Kendall just shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes glued to his coffee mug, completely mute. "Excuse me," Courtney snapped, turning her glaring eyes back to me. "You are saying no. We are your family. We are trying to build generational wealth, and you are going to hoard a rotting wooden cabin out of sheer stubbornness." "Courtney," I said, maintaining my composure, keeping my voice steady to avoid scaring my granddaughter. "That house was built on the sweat and tears of my wife. It is not a bargaining chip for a clothing store. The answer is no. Put the papers away. Let us finish breakfast." But Courtney did not put the papers away. She stood up the legs of her chair, screeching harshly against the floor tiles. The mask of the polite, refined society woman completely shattered. She began to raise her voice, her tone turning venomous and erratic. "You are a selfish, cheap old man holding on to the past," she screamed, slamming her hands down on the table. Layla jumped, dropping her crayon. "You sit in this house with all your money watching us struggle to elevate ourselves. Kendall deserves that property. I deserve it. We are suffocating in debt trying to keep up our lifestyle, and you are just hoarding assets like a senile fool. Her words were laced with a deep, toxic disrespect that went beyond the money. It was the resentment of a woman who felt she was owed the fruits of my labor simply by marrying my son. She paced around the kitchen island, her breathing heavy, completely ignoring the fact that her own daughter was watching her with wide, terrified eyes. "You do not understand how the real world works anymore, Corey," she yelled, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You think your little engineer pension makes you special. You owe us this. You are going to sign this deed right now, or I swear to God you will never see Layla again." Using my granddaughter as a bargaining chip was the final line. I felt a cold, hard anger settle into my bones, but I did not raise my voice. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You will not speak to me that way in my own home. Take your papers and leave." Courtney let out a furious, animalistic sound. She lunged forward across the table. Before I could even register the movement, her hand whipped through the air. The slap sounded like a firecracker detonating in the small kitchen. The force of her palm struck my left cheek with brutal, unhinged power. My head snapped to the side. A sharp, stinging heat exploded across my skin. The impact was so violent that it dislodged my hearing aid. I heard the tiny piece of plastic clatter against the ceramic floor sliding under the refrigerator. For 3 agonizing seconds, the world went completely deaf in my left ear. The silence was immediately shattered by a high-pitched, heartbroken wail. Layla had burst into tears, covering her face with her small hands, traumatized by the sudden explosion of violence from her own mother. My cheek burned with a fiery intensity. A grown woman had just struck a 69-year-old man in his own kitchen. I did not yell. I did not touch my face. I did not retaliate. The physical sting was nothing compared to the profound, icy clarity that washed over my mind in that exact moment. Slowly, deliberately, I turned my head to look at my son, Kendall. The boy I had protected from the cruelties of this world. The boy I had spent 80-hour work weeks for swallowing the bitter pills of racial prejudice in the corporate engineering world of the 1980s, just so he could attend private schools and never know the sting of poverty. I had given him every advantage, every tool to become a strong, honorable man. I looked at him waiting for the man I raised to stand up, waiting for him to slam his fist on the table, to grab his wife by the arm, to defend his father, to comfort his sobbing child. I waited for a single ounce of masculine dignity to show itself. But Kendall did nothing. He sat paralyzed in his chair. He glanced up at me for a fraction of a second, his eyes wide with a pathetic, cowardly panic, and then he looked away. He actually turned his face toward the window, shrinking his broad shoulders physically, trying to disappear into the background rather than confront the monster he had married. He let his wife's violence hang in the air completely unchallenged. In that excruciating silence, as my granddaughter cried, and my daughter-in-law stood there panting with arrogant rage, the son I had loved for 35 years died in my eyes. He was no longer my child. He was a hollow, spineless shell of a human being who had traded his soul, his heritage, and his father's respect for the illusion of fitting into Courtney's toxic, materialistic world. He was an accomplice. I did not feel sadness. I did not feel grief. I felt a cold, mechanical precision take over my brain. Like a structural engineer examining a condemned building, I saw every crack in their foundation. They thought they could bully an old man. They mistook my quiet demeanor for weakness. They had no idea that beneath my calm exterior was a mind trained to calculate the exact amount of pressure needed to bring a towering structure crashing down to the earth. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I walked over to the refrigerator, knelt down with deliberate calmness, and picked up my hearing aid from the floor. I dusted it off and placed it back into my ear. The sounds of Layla's crying and Courtney's heavy breathing rushed back in. I did not pick it up to listen to their excuses. I picked it up because it was time to make my move. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. When you spend your life calculating the exact limits of steel and concrete, you learn how to handle pressure. You learn that panic is the enemy of stability. Courtney stood on the other side of the kitchen island, her chest heaving, her eyes darting between me and the door. She was waiting for me to yell. She was waiting for me to throw a tantrum to match her chaotic energy so she could play the victim. I gave her absolutely nothing. I unlocked my screen and tapped the contact name for Dominic. Dominic was not just any lawyer. He was a ruthless, brilliant attorney who specialized in asset protection and corporate warfare. I had been paying his retainer for 3 weeks, quietly preparing for the exact moment my son's house of cards collapsed. The line rang twice before he answered. "I need you to initiate Protocol B," I said. My voice was low and clear. "Understood," Corey Dominic replied instantly. It is done. I hung up. I did not look at Courtney. I did not look at Kendall. I simply opened my contacts again and tapped the name Sylvia. Sylvia was the chief financial officer of the firm where Kendall worked as a senior project manager. She was a woman who dealt in hard numbers and possessed zero tolerance for fraud. The phone connected. It is time, I told her. Come over. I will be there in 30 minutes. Sylvia responded. I have the files in the car. I ended the call and placed my phone face down on the granite countertop. The entire exchange took less than 40 seconds. 2 phone calls, 14 words in total. That was all it took to dismantle the fake empire my daughter-in-law had built. Courtney let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the kitchen walls. She crossed her arms, her acrylic nails digging into the sleeves of her expensive cashmere sweater. Are you serious right now? She sneered, stepping closer to me. Did you just call the police on us? Are you actually calling the cops on your own family because you are too bitter to help us out? You really are pathetic, Corey. Go ahead, let the police come. Tell them your daughter-in-law yelled at you. Let us see who they believe. A successful young couple or a bitter old man holding on to a worthless cabin. I did not answer her. I walked past her, pulled out my chair and sat back down at the dining table. I picked up my mug of black coffee. It had gone completely cold, but I took a slow, deliberate sip anyway. My silence infuriated her more than any insult could have. Narcissists feed on reactions. When you deny them a reaction, they starve, and their behavior becomes increasingly erratic. Fine, Courtney snapped. She spun around and marched toward the living room, grabbing Layla by the wrist. Layla stumbled, her small face streaked with tears, looking back at me with pleading eyes. Come on, Layla. We are leaving. We are not spending another second in this toxic house with this crazy old man. Courtney began violently shoving Layla's coloring books and markers into her designer tote bag. She moved frantically, tearing through the living room to gather their coats. Kendall finally stood up, but he just hovered awkwardly near the hallway, useless and pathetic, murmuring Courtney's name in a weak attempt to calm her down. She ignored him completely. You are never going to see her again, Corey. Courtney screamed from the hallway, pointing a shaking finger at me. Do you hear me? You are dead to us. I will make sure you never get a single phone call, never attend another birthday party, and never spend another Christmas with my granddaughter. You can rot in this empty house with your precious lake house deed. You chose a piece of wood over your own blood. She expected me to break. She expected me to beg her to stay, to plead for access to my granddaughter. She was using a 7-year-old child as a human shield to extort a piece of real estate. It was the ultimate structural failure of her character. I took another sip of my cold coffee. I kept my posture straight, my eyes fixed on the oak table. I did not say a word. I let her scream. I let her hurl every insult she could think of. I let her completely dig her own grave. Every threat she made, every vile word she spat only confirmed that I was making the right decision. You do not negotiate with terrorists, and you do not finance the people who view your love as a weakness to be exploited. The minutes dragged on. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Courtney had packed Layla's backpack and threw it by the front door, but she did not actually leave. She was bluffing. She wanted the confrontation. She paced the living room, checking her phone, muttering curses under her breath, waiting for the imaginary police cruisers to arrive so she could play the weeping victim. She was entirely unaware of the actual storm gathering right above her head. 36 minutes passed. I counted every single one of them by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. 36 minutes of unbearable tension of Layla quietly sobbing on the sofa, of Kendall standing like a frozen statue, and of Courtney pacing like a caged animal. I watched them with the clinical detachment of a man surveying a condemned building right before the demolition charges detonate. They had spent years chipping away at the load-bearing walls of our family, and they had absolutely no idea that the roof was about to cave in. Then the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the silence. Courtney stopped pacing. She looked out the large front window, her posture instantly shifting from aggressive rage to arrogant triumph. A sleek black luxury sedan had pulled up to the curb. The sunlight caught the polished hood, making the expensive vehicle gleam. Courtney let out a smug, victorious sigh. She turned to Kendall, who was still hovering near the kitchen counter. "See," she said, her voice dripping with extreme arrogance. "My parents are here. I texted my mother right after he refused to sign the papers. They are coming to get us. They are going to bring their lawyers, and we will see how smug your father acts when he is dealing with people who actually have real money and real power." She grabbed her handbag, threw her shoulders back, and marched toward the front door, eager to welcome her reinforcements. She reached for the brass handle, a triumphant smirk plastered across her face, completely ready to escalate her performance for an audience. But Kendall had also looked out the window. I watched my son's face. I watched the exact second his eyes focused on the black car. I watched all the blood instantly drain from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His jaw went completely slack. His hands, which had been resting on the edge of the kitchen island, began to shake violently. He recognized the license plate. He recognized the make and model of the car. The car door opened outside. The heavy thud echoed all the way into the living room. Courtney swung the front door wide open, her fake high society smile ready to greet who she assumed was her wealthy mother. Kendall did not walk to the door. His knees literally buckled beneath him. He collapsed right there on the kitchen floor, hitting the ceramic tiles with a heavy thud. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders heaving, and he began to sob. It was not a quiet cry. It was a guttural, terrifying sound of absolute, unavoidable ruin. He wept with the sheer panic of a man who knew his entire life, his career, and his freedom were officially over. Courtney's smirk vanished the second she saw the person stepping up onto my porch. The woman standing on my porch was not Courtney's wealthy mother. She was Sylvia Gallagher, the chief financial officer of the engineering firm where Kendall had worked for the past 8 years. Sylvia was a woman carved from corporate ice. She wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit holding a thick leather briefcase. Her eyes locked onto Courtney with a mix of professional disgust and absolute zero tolerance. Courtney froze her hand, still resting on the brass door handle. Her arrogant smirk melted into a mask of pure confusion. She looked from Sylvia to the sleek black sedan in the driveway, realizing this was not the rescue she had orchestrated. Sylvia stepped past her without asking for permission. She walked straight into my living room, her heels clicking methodically against the hardwood floor. She looked down at Kendall, who was still curled on the ceramic tiles of the kitchen, sobbing into his hands. He did not even look up. He knew exactly why she was here. "Good morning, Corey," Sylvia said, her tone calm and respectful as she turned to me. "I have the finalized documents right here." "Thank you, Sylvia," I replied. "I appreciate you coming personally." Courtney finally snapped out of her shock. She marched back into the kitchen, her voice rising in a shrill panic. "Who are you? What is going on? Kendall, get up off the floor. Tell this woman to leave our house." "It is not your house, Courtney," Sylvia stated, not even raising her voice. "And judging by the files I have spent the last 3 weeks reviewing, you do not actually own anything at all. Everything you wear, everything you drive, and everything you boast about has been funded by stolen corporate capital." Sylvia placed her briefcase on my kitchen island right next to the fraudulent deed Courtney had tried to force me to sign. She unclasped it and pulled out a stack of banking records. For the past 3 weeks, Sylvia continued looking directly at my trembling son. "Your father has been quietly forwarding me encrypted emails, bank statements, and suspicious transaction logs that Kendall carelessly left logged in on his old laptop. We initiated a silent internal audit. Kendall has systematically embezzled $150,000 from our corporate expansion fund." Courtney gasped, stumbling back a step. I watched her face carefully. There was a brief flash of genuine surprise, but it was instantly swallowed by a vicious, calculating panic. She looked at Kendall, who was still rocking back and forth on the floor, incapable of defending himself. "You did what Courtney shrieked, kicking Kendall's shoe. You stole money. Are you out of your mind?" Sylvia did not let Courtney play the innocent victim. She picked up the deed to my lake house and tossed it directly at Courtney's chest. The papers scattered across the floor. "Do not insult our intelligence," Sylvia said coldly. "You did not want Corey's lake house to open a luxury fashion boutique. You wanted the deed to secure a rapid commercial equity loan because Kendall knew our quarterly audit begins tomorrow morning at 8. You needed a massive influx of cash by Monday to replace the stolen corporate funds before the auditors found the black hole in his ledger. You were trying to use this man's hard-earned property to cover up a federal crime. The truth hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. This was the deeply buried secret finally exploding into the light. Kendall had bled my accounts dry for years, but when I finally cut off his allowance, he turned to stealing from his employer to keep up with Courtney's insatiable demands for designer clothes, expensive vacations, and a fake high society status. He traded his freedom for her approval. Courtney's survival instinct kicked in. The illusion of the supportive power couple vanished instantly. She backed away from Kendall as if he were a diseased animal. "I had nothing to do with this," Courtney screamed, her voice cracking with desperate self-preservation. "I did not know he was stealing. He told me he got bonuses. He told me he was promoted. I am a victim here. I am not going down for his pathetic mistakes. You are a failure, Kendall. You dragged me into this mess." Kendall finally looked up, his face stained with tears. "Courtney, please." He begged, his voice a pathetic croak. "I did it for you. You said you would leave me if we had to move to a smaller house. You said I was not providing enough. I did everything you asked." Sylvia ignored their pathetic domestic dispute. She zipped her briefcase shut. "Kendall Rollins, you are officially terminated from your position, effective immediately. Our legal department has already handed the entire dossier, including the evidence your father provided, over to the FBI. They are drafting the arrest warrants as we speak. I highly suggest you spend the rest of your day finding a criminal defense attorney, assuming you can afford one." The absolute finality of Sylvia's words sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The game was over. There were no more lies to spin, no more fake rich facades to uphold, and no more of my money to steal. I stood up from the dining table. My patience was completely exhausted. "Get out," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a judge dropping a gavel. "Both of you, get out of my house." Kendall slowly scrambled to his feet, leaning heavily against the counter. He looked at me, a broken, defeated man, hoping for a final shred of paternal rescue. He found absolutely none. I stared right through him. Courtney, however, was not done fighting. Her eyes darted frantically around the room until they landed on Layla. My granddaughter was still huddled on the sofa, clutching her coloring book, terrified by the screaming adults. "Come here!" Layla Courtney barked, marching toward the living room. "We are leaving right now. We are getting in the car and we are disappearing. I am not letting these people take you away from me." Courtney reached her hands out, attempting to snatch the little girl by her arm. She was planning to use Layla as a hostage, a final piece of leverage in her collapsing world. Before Courtney could even touch her, Sylvia stepped directly into her path. Sylvia was taller, stronger, and possessed an aura of authority that made Courtney freeze in her tracks. "I would strongly advise against that," Sylvia warned, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Child Protective Services is already on standby. Given the impending federal indictments for major financial fraud, attempting to flee the jurisdiction with a minor child will trigger an immediate Amber Alert and add kidnapping to your rapidly growing list of federal charges. You have zero income frozen bank accounts, and you are currently a massive flight risk." Courtney's jaw clamped shut. She looked from Sylvia to me. "Layla is staying right here with her grandfather." Sylvia finalized, stepping closer until Courtney was forced to back away. "The authorities are well aware that Corey Rollins provides a stable, safe, and financially secure environment. You, on the other hand, provide nothing but a liability. Leave the premises before Corey calls the local police to escort you out for trespassing." Courtney realized she was completely boxed in. Every single exit was sealed. She had no money, no leverage, and no child to use as a pawn. She grabbed her designer handbag, the leather now looking cheap and ridiculous in the face of her impending ruin. She glared at me, her eyes burning with a venomous, unhinged hatred that promised a dirty, scorched earth war. "You are going to regret this, old man," Courtney hissed through gritted teeth. "I will destroy you." She turned on her heel and stormed out the front door, slamming it so hard the windows rattled. Kendall lingered for a fraction of a second, opening his mouth to speak, but the absolute disgust in my eyes stopped him. He lowered his head and followed his wife out into the cold reality of their consequences. I watched from the window as they drove away in a car they technically no longer owned. The driveway was empty. The house was quiet again. I walked over to the sofa, sat down next to Layla, and gently wrapped my arms around her trembling shoulders. The first battle was won, but I knew the hurricane was just beginning. 3 days passed in a fragile, heavy quiet. I kept Layla insulated from the chaos, painting the illusion of a normal week. We baked cookies using Naomi's old recipe. We read books on the back porch. I made sure she felt safe, but I knew Courtney was not going to simply walk away into the abyss. A cornered predator is at its most dangerous right before it strikes. As an engineer, I knew that when a structure undergoes a catastrophic shift, the resulting shock waves do not stop immediately. They travel through the foundation, seeking the path of least resistance. Courtney was out of money, out of leverage, and facing federal charges. I was the reinforced wall she was trying to break, and Layla was the hammer she intended to use. The strike came on Wednesday afternoon. We were sitting at the kitchen table working on a jigsaw puzzle when the sharp, aggressive pounding on the front door made Layla jump. It was not a polite knock. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of authority. I walked to the door, checking the security monitor on my phone. 2 uniformed police officers stood on my porch, flanking a woman in a beige pantsuit carrying a thick clipboard. I opened the door, keeping my posture relaxed and my hands visible. Corey Rollins, the older officer, asked, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. "I am," I replied smoothly. "How can I help you, officers?" The woman in the pantsuit stepped forward. "Mr. Rollins, I am Agent Miller with Child Protective Services. We are here regarding a severe emergency report filed by your daughter-in-law, Courtney Rollins, and corroborated by your son, Kendall Rollins. We have a temporary emergency removal order for a minor, Layla Rollins." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I felt the air leave my lungs. Agent Miller did not flinch. "Your daughter-in-law filed a sworn affidavit stating that you are suffering from severe undiagnosed dementia. She claimed that you recently became violent, physically attacked her, and that you are currently keeping Layla in a hazardous, abusive environment. She reported that you are exhibiting erratic, dangerous behavior and are entirely unfit to supervise a child." It was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood. Courtney knew she had no money and no power left, so she leveraged the state to do her dirty work. She had spun my refusal to be robbed into a narrative of elderly insanity. She was trying to paint me as a senile, violent old man holding a child hostage. Layla peeked her head around the hallway corner. Seeing the police officers, her small face crumpled in fear. She ran to me, wrapping her arms tightly around my leg, hiding her face against my jeans. Agent Miller looked down at her with a practiced, neutral expression. "Mr. Rollins, under the parameters of the emergency order, we must take the child into temporary protective custody while we investigate these claims. Since her biological parents are currently under investigation themselves, she will be placed in an emergency foster placement until the court evaluates your mental competency." A primal roaring anger flared up in my chest. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to slam the door, to barricade the house, to physically shield my granddaughter from these strangers. I wanted to yell that Courtney was a liar, an embezzler, a woman who would sell her own family for a designer handbag. But my engineering mind overrode my heart. I looked at the police officers. I saw the blinking red light of their body cameras. I knew exactly what this was. This was a stress test. Courtney was banking on me losing my temper. She wanted me to shout, to resist, to grab Layla and act like a deranged, aggressive old man. If I raised my voice, if I showed even a fraction of the rage burning inside me, the body camera footage would be played in court as undeniable proof of my erratic hostility. It would instantly validate her fake dementia claims. I took a deep breath, locking my emotions behind an impenetrable vault. I knelt down to Layla's level, maintaining a soft, reassuring smile. "Layla, sweetie, look at me," I said softly. She looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. "These nice people are going to take you on a little sleepover for a few days. It is just a silly rule we have to follow. You are going to be perfectly safe, and I promise you, Grandpa is going to come get you very soon." "But I want to stay with you," she sobbed, clutching my shirt. "I know, baby, I know, but we have to be brave right now. Can you be brave for Grandpa?" She nodded slowly, wiping her nose. I stood up and looked at Agent Miller. "Let me pack her a bag," I said calmly. "I will not cause a scene. I understand you are just executing an order based on fraudulent information." The police officers exchanged a brief, confused glance. They had clearly been briefed to expect a violent, demented suspect. Instead, they were dealing with a highly articulate, composed professional who was completely compliant. I packed Layla's favorite pajamas, her toothbrush, and the stuffed bear Naomi had given her. I walked her to the front door, kissed her forehead, and handed her small bag to the CPS agent. Watching them lead my crying granddaughter down the driveway and put her into the back of a sterile government vehicle was the single most excruciating moment of my entire life. It took every ounce of willpower I had ever cultivated to stand on my porch with my hands folded behind my back, watching the taillights disappear down the street. The house fell into a deafening, hollow silence. The quiet was absolute, heavy, and toxic. Before leaving, Agent Miller had handed me a thick manila envelope containing the court mandates. I walked back into the kitchen, sat at the table where Courtney had slapped me just 3 days prior, and opened the file. The paperwork outlined the emergency custody suspension and the terms for my defense. Courtney had moved with terrifying speed, employing a sleazy family law attorney she must have hired on credit. Because she had cited imminent danger and elderly mental decline, the court required me to undergo a mandatory expedited psychological evaluation to clear my name before I could even petition for a custody hearing. I scanned the documents until my eyes landed on the bottom of the second page. The court had assigned a specific psychiatric evaluator for my case, expedited and approved by the judge based on an emergency motion filed by Courtney's lawyer. The name on the document was Dr. Eris Thorne. I stared at the printed name. It was entirely irregular for the accusing party to fast-track a specific doctor for a court-mandated evaluation unless there was a pre-existing relationship or a heavy financial incentive involved. Courtney did not just want me evaluated. She wanted me diagnosed. She had handpicked the battlefield and supplied her own executioner. She was paying a doctor to medically certify me as incompetent, which would not only permanently strip me of Layla, but would grant Kendall conservatorship over my entire estate. They wanted the lake house, my pension, and my assets, and they were going to use a rigged medical diagnosis to legally rob me while hiding behind the guise of family concern. Courtney thought she had backed me into a corner where logic could not save me. I did not panic. I reached for my phone and dialed Dominic's number. "We have a problem," Dominic answered, already knowing about the raid. "No, Dominic," I replied, my voice steady, staring at the name on the court order. "We do not have a problem. We have an opportunity. Tell our private investigator to look into a Dr. Eris Thorne immediately. Find his debts, his vices, and his bank records. I am scheduled for an evaluation, and I need to know exactly how much Courtney is paying him to lie." The waiting room of the psychiatric clinic was designed to be soothing, with its pale blue walls and soft instrumental music playing from hidden speakers. But the examination room of Dr. Eris Thorne was a textbook display of manufactured authority. Leather chairs, a massive mahogany desk, and expensive medical diplomas framed in heavy oak. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on my knees, observing the man Courtney had paid to destroy my life. Dr. Thorne was in his late 40s, wearing a tailored suit under a pristine white coat. He carried a demeanor of absolute, unearned superiority. He did not look at me as a patient. He looked at me as an obstacle he had been hired to remove. Mr. Rollins Thorne began, his voice dripping with that slow, patronizing tone people usually reserve for toddlers. "I understand this process can be very confusing for someone in your condition. We are just going to have a little chat. Let us start with something simple. Can you tell me what year it is?" I looked at him. I did not blink. "It is 2026, Dr. Thorne." "Good, very good," he replied, making a slow, deliberate mark on his legal pad. "I want you to remember 3 words for me: apple, table, and coin. I will ask you to repeat them later. Now, do you know why your family felt the need to bring you here today? They mentioned you have been experiencing episodes of severe paranoia. They said you have been hoarding financial documents and accusing them of theft. The framing of the question was a blatant trap. If I denied it angrily, I was aggressive. If I explained the embezzlement, I was paranoid. He was attempting to lay the foundation for a dementia diagnosis right out of the gate. "My family did not bring me here," I stated smoothly. "A court order brought me here based on an affidavit filed by a woman who is currently under federal investigation for corporate fraud. I am here to comply with a legal mandate." Thorne sighed, offering a condescending, practiced smile of pity. "Mr. Rollins, part of cognitive decline is the manifestation of elaborate delusions. It is very common for patients to invent conspiracies involving their loved ones. It is a defense mechanism. Let us test your cognitive load. I am going to ask you to count backward from 100 by sevens. Take your time." I stared at him, calculating the exact moment the load-bearing wall of his career would shatter. I recited the numbers flawlessly without a single microsecond of hesitation. 100, 93, 86, 79. I continued until I reached 2, keeping my voice entirely monotone. Thorne did not look impressed. In fact, he looked annoyed. He scribbled another aggressive note on his pad, completely disregarding my perfect cognitive function. "Memorization can sometimes persist even in advanced stages of Alzheimer's," he muttered, blatantly fabricating a medical justification to fail me. "Let us talk about the incident on Sunday. Your daughter-in-law reported that you violently attacked her without provocation." "I did not attack anyone," I replied, my voice remaining as still as a frozen lake. "I refused to sign a deed to my property and she struck me in the face. Apple, table, coin." Thorne paused, his pen hovering over the paper. The seamless integration of his memory test words threw him off balance for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered his arrogant composure. "Mr. Rollins' dementia often causes a reversal of memory. The aggressor believes they are the victim. Given your undeniable hostility and the severe allegations of child endangerment, I am leaning toward recommending an immediate full-time conservatorship for your own safety." He reached for a heavy medical form, ready to sign my life away. The door to the examination room opened. It did not just open, it swung wide with the authoritative force of a man who owned the building. Dominic walked in. My lawyer wore a dark navy suit that cost more than Thorne's entire office furniture collection. He did not knock. He did not introduce himself. He simply walked directly to the mahogany desk, pulled up a chair beside me, and sat down. Thorne bristled, his face flushing with immediate outrage. "Excuse me," Thorne demanded, half rising from his leather chair. "This is a closed medical evaluation. You cannot simply barge into my office. Security will be called." Dominic ignored the threat completely. He calmly reached into his sleek leather briefcase, pulled out an iPad, and placed it flat on the center of Thorne's desk. "My name is Dominic Vance," he said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "I am the chief legal counsel for Mr. Corey Rollins, and we are not going to call security Dr. Thorne, because if anyone is going to be called today, it will be the State Medical Licensing Board." Thorne froze. The arrogant bluster vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden rigid caution. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Thorne said defensively. Dominic tapped the screen of the iPad. A high-definition video began to play. The footage was taken from a coffee shop across town, time-stamped exactly 48 hours prior. The camera angle was perfect, captured by the private investigator we had hired the second I saw Thorne's name on the court mandate. The video clearly showed Dr. Thorne sitting in a secluded corner booth. Seconds later, Courtney walked into the frame. She sat across from him, looking frantic and desperate. There was no audio, but the actions were universally understood. Courtney reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. She slid it across the table. Thorne looked around nervously, took the envelope, opened the flap just enough to reveal thick stacks of $100 bills, and quickly shoved it into his briefcase. When a building's foundation fails, there is a distinct agonizing sound of concrete giving way before the structure completely collapses. I watched Dr. Thorne experience that exact structural failure in real time. His eyes widened. His jaw went slack. The confident posture he had maintained for the last 20 minutes vanished, replaced by the instinctual terror of a man who realized he had stepped onto a landmine. Dominic let the video loop twice before he reached out and paused it right on a frozen frame of Thorne holding the bribe money. The silence in the examination room was absolute. The clinical hum of the air conditioning unit suddenly sounded like a roaring jet engine. I watched Thorne's face drain of all color. His pristine white coat suddenly looked like a prison uniform. That, Dominic stated smoothly, is a Class 2 felony. Accepting a cash bribe to falsify a psychiatric evaluation for the purpose of elder abuse and financial extortion. That is not just the end of your medical license, doctor. That is a guaranteed minimum of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Thorne began to sweat. Small beads formed on his forehead. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the iPad, then at Dominic, and finally at me. He realized instantly that he was not dealing with a senile old man. He was dealing with a meticulously prepared execution squad. "I can explain," Thorne stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "It is not what it looks like. She told me it was a consultation fee." Dominic reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a fresh, uncreased document. He laid it gently over Thorne's notepad, completely covering the fake dementia diagnosis the doctor had been drafting. "Save the desperate lies for the medical board," Dominic commanded. "Right now, you are going to focus on redemption." The document in front of you is a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation certificate. It clearly states, under penalty of perjury, that you have conducted a thorough examination of Corey Rollins and found him to be in perfect superior mental health. It explicitly notes that he shows absolutely zero signs of dementia, paranoia, or cognitive decline, and is fully capable of managing his own affairs and retaining full custody of his grandchild. Thorne stared at the paper. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold his pen. "If I sign this," Thorne whispered, his eyes darting frantically toward the door. "Does the video go away?" Dominic leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "If you sign this, the video stays in my encrypted vault. If you refuse, or if you ever communicate with Courtney Rollins again, I will personally hand-deliver this iPad to the district attorney before you can even make it to the parking lot." Thorne did not hesitate for another second. He grabbed his pen, clicked it, and rapidly signed his name at the bottom of the certificate. He stamped it with his official medical seal, practically shoving the paper back across the desk toward Dominic. He was breathing heavily, a broken, defeated man who had just traded his professional integrity for a sliver of temporary freedom. Dominic calmly picked up the certificate, inspected the signature, and slid it neatly into his briefcase. He then picked up the iPad and turned off the screen. I stood up, adjusting my jacket. I looked down at Thorne, feeling absolutely no pity for the mercenary who tried to sell my sanity for a stack of cash. Dominic smiled, a chilling, razor-sharp expression that promised nothing but future pain. "Thank you for your accurate medical assessment," Dr. Dominic said smoothly. "Now let us talk about medical fraud." The heavy oak door of the clinic closed behind Dominic and me, sealing Dr. Thorne inside his own self-made prison. We walked out into the bright afternoon sun, holding the one document that completely dismantled Courtney's leverage. But I knew the day was far from over. When a structural support beam snaps, the rest of the building does not fall immediately. It groans, it shifts, and the weaker materials begin to buckle under the displaced weight. That buckling happened exactly at midnight. I was awake, sitting in the dark kitchen with a glass of ice water. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford until Layla was safely back in her room down the hall. The house was entirely silent until the motion sensor floodlight in the backyard suddenly clicked on, casting a harsh, blinding glare across the patio. I stood up and walked to the sliding glass door. A figure was moving frantically through the shadows near the rose bushes. It was Kendall. He looked like a hunted animal. His expensive designer suit jacket was gone. His dress shirt was untucked and wrinkled, and his tie hung loosely around his neck like a broken noose. He darted toward the patio, his eyes wide and bloodshot, scanning the street behind him, as if he expected federal agents to tackle him onto the grass. He reached the glass door and pressed his palms flat against it, tapping frantically with his knuckles. "Dad, please open the door," he mouthed through the glass, his breath fogging up the pain. I slid the lock back and opened the door just a few inches. The cool night air rushed in, bringing with it the sour smell of stale sweat and sheer panic radiating from my son. "What are you doing here, Kendall?" I asked, keeping my voice low and devoid of any warmth. "They froze everything, Dad." Kendall gasped, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. Sylvia was not bluffing. "The FBI executed a warrant this afternoon. Every single bank account is locked. My checking my savings, the joint accounts with Courtney, all of our credit cards are declining. I tried to buy gas and the terminal seized the card. Dad, I am facing a federal indictment for corporate embezzlement. They are talking about 10 years in federal prison. 10 years. He grabbed the edge of the sliding door, his fingers gripping the aluminum frame desperately. "I need a lawyer, Dad. I need a high-powered criminal defense attorney right now, or they are going to bury me. But I do not have a single cent to my name. Courtney is screaming at me, blaming me for everything. You have your retirement savings, you have your pension, and the equity in this house. Please, you have to cash it out. You have to hire someone to keep me out of federal prison. I am your son. Please, Dad, you have to save me." I looked at the terrified, pathetic man standing on my patio. He was begging for the very assets his wife had tried to steal from me just days ago. He wanted me to liquidate the foundation of my life, to buy his way out of the consequences he actively chose. "No," I said. The word was simple, quiet, and absolutely immovable. Kendall stared at me, his eyes widening in horror as if he could not process the rejection. "What do you mean, no?" "Dad, I will go to jail. You cannot just leave me to rot." "You are going to reap exactly what you sowed, Kendall," I replied, my voice steady, cutting through the cool midnight air like a scalpel. "You stand here demanding my retirement savings. Do you even remember how those savings were built? Do you remember the 80-hour work weeks?" I stepped closer to the gap in the door, forcing him to look me in the eye. "I spent 30 years climbing steel scaffolds in the blazing sun and freezing rain. I breathed concrete dust and swallowed the daily, unspoken racial prejudices of the 1980s corporate engineering world. I endured bosses who spoke down to me, colleagues who took credit for my blueprints, and a society that expected me to fail. I swallowed all my pride every single day so I could pay the tuition for that elite, predominantly white university you demanded to attend. I built the bridge for you to cross into a better life." Kendall swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the patio stones. "And how did you repay that sacrifice?" I continued, my tone lowering into a dangerous, icy whisper. "You crossed that bridge and then you burned it down so your new friends would not see where you came from. The moment you met Courtney, you erased your heritage. You stopped bringing your college friends home because this house was not wealthy enough for them. You asked me to park my truck 2 blocks away at your graduation so Courtney's parents would not see it. You placed me at a corner table at your own wedding, hidden away like an embarrassing secret while her family took center stage." "Dad, I was just trying to fit in." Kendall sobbed, tears spilling over his cheeks. "Courtney's world is different. It is ruthless. I just wanted to give us a good life." "You did not want a good life. You wanted a fake life," I corrected him harshly. "You wanted the illusion of elite white privilege. and you were willing to steal from your employer and betray your own father to fund it. You stood in my kitchen and watched that woman slap me across the face. You watched her use your own daughter as a pawn. You chose her world, Kendall. And in her world, when the money runs out, you are entirely worthless. Now pay the toll. Dad, please, I am begging you, Kendall cried out, his voice cracking into a high, agonizing wail. He dropped to his knees on the hard concrete patio, his hands clasping together in a desperate prayer. I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything. Please do not let them lock me away. Looking down at him, I felt a brief, sharp pang of a father's sorrow. Somewhere deep inside that broken man was the little boy I used to carry on my shoulders. But that boy was gone, suffocated by greed and cowardice. To save him now would only validate his weakness. Sometimes the only way to reinforce a collapsing structure is to let the rotten wood burn completely to the ground. I will not finance your salvation, Kendall, I said. You need to learn how to stand up on your own. I stepped backward into the kitchen. I slid the heavy glass door completely shut, the latch clicking into place with a sharp, definitive sound. I reached up and pulled the security blinds closed, cutting off his pleading face. I stood in the dark kitchen, listening to his muffled sobs through the glass until eventually the sounds faded into the night as he slunk away into the shadows. The next morning arrived with a bright, deceptive sunshine. I was sitting at the dining table drinking my black coffee and reviewing Dominic's legal strategy for the custody hearing. I knew Courtney was rapidly running out of moves. With Kendall facing prison and their accounts frozen, she was financially cornered. But a narcissist never fights their own battles when they can summon an army. I heard the low, powerful purr of a high-end engine outside. I stood up and walked to the front window. A sleek silver Mercedes-Benz glided into my driveway, its pristine paint reflecting the morning light. The car did not park politely by the curb. It pulled aggressively onto my property, stopping just inches from my garage door. The driver's side door opened, and a tall, impeccably dressed older white man stepped out, adjusting his expensive tailored blazer. From the passenger side emerged a woman dripping in gold jewelry and designer silk. They were Courtney's parents, the architects of her entitlement. And judging by the furious, arrogant strides they took toward my front porch, they had come to put me in my place. The Mercedes-Benz in my driveway belonged to Richard and Eleanor Vance Courtney's parents. They were the kind of people who believed their money was a substitute for morality. I watched them march up the walkway, Eleanor clutching a designer handbag, Richard carrying himself with the rigid entitlement of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. They did not knock. Richard simply pounded on the doorframe with his fist. I opened the door, standing squarely in the threshold. I did not invite them in. Corey, Richard said, his tone abrupt and commanding. We need to talk. Now. He attempted to push past me into the house. I did not move. I braced my weight, forcing him to stop short or physically run into me. You can speak from right there, Richard. I replied, my voice calm but laced with absolute authority. My house is currently closed to uninvited guests. Richard's face tightened. He was not used to being denied entry, especially by a black man he secretly viewed as his social inferior. Eleanor stepped forward, trying to play the diplomat, though her condescending smile betrayed her true feelings. Corey, please, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with fake concern. We are all family here. We just want to find a solution to this horrible misunderstanding. Courtney is devastated. Kendall is a mess. And poor little Layla is stuck in the system. We have a way to fix all of this. Richard reached into his tailored blazer and pulled out a crisp, light blue check. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it onto the small entryway table just inside my door. It landed with a soft flutter. $50,000, Richard announced, his chest puffing out slightly. I am offering to buy the lake house from you, Corey. Cash. Right now. We know Kendall is facing legal trouble and Courtney needs capital to secure an aggressive family law attorney to regain custody of Layla. We are willing to take that rotting cabin off your hands so you can have some cash and my daughter can have her daughter back. I looked at the check. It was a pathetic, insulting offer. The lake house was worth at least 4 times that amount, but the money was not the point. The point was control. Consider it a favor, Richard continued, leaning closer, lowering his voice into a subtle racist threat. You know how these family court battles go, Corey. When a judge looks at Courtney, they see a refined upper-class mother with strong community ties. When they look at you, well, let us just say the optics are not in your favor. You do not have the resources to fight us. Take the check, sign over the deed, walk away quietly, and we will make sure Courtney allows you to see Layla on holidays. He was offering to buy my compliance, He was offering to fund the very legal war that would strip my granddaughter from me forever, using my own property to do it. I picked up the check from the table. I held it between my fingers, feeling the crisp paper. $50,000, I repeated slowly, letting the number hang in the air. That is more than fair for a place you barely use, Eleanor chimed in, assuming I was considering the offer. I did not break eye contact with Richard. I placed my thumbs on the top edge of the check and slowly, deliberately tore it in half. Richard's eyes widened. Eleanor gasped. I placed the two halves together and tore them again. I kept tearing until the $50,000 bribe was nothing more than a handful of useless blue confetti. I opened my hand and let the pieces fall onto the porch, scattering across Richard's polished leather shoes. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, his face turning a deep, furious red. "Are you out of your mind?" "No, Richard," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "I am just a man who knows exactly what his assets are worth. But more importantly, I know exactly what your assets are worth." Richard scoffed, trying to regain his dominant posture. "You know nothing about my assets. I know that Vance Regional Supermarkets operates 14 locations across the state," I said, watching his arrogant expression begin to crack. "I know that your flagship store in the Northern District has been operating at a 20% loss for the last 4 quarters. I know that you recently took out a massive commercial loan from Horizon Equity Bank to cover your failing supply chain costs, and I know that you missed your last 2 balloon payments. You are not a wealthy man, Richard. You are a drowning man pretending to swim." Eleanor grabbed Richard's arm, her face going pale. "Richard, how does he know that?" "Because Eleanor," I continued, stepping closer to them, forcing them to back up a step. "I spent 40 years managing municipal infrastructure contracts. I know how to read a balance sheet, and I know the executives at Horizon Equity Bank very well. I know that your debt is currently sitting in their distressed asset portfolio." Richard was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. "You are bluffing," he spat, though his voice lacked conviction. "Am I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You came to my house to threaten me with your social standing. You tried to buy my property to fund a fraudulent custody battle. You thought you could intimidate an old black man because you assumed I was broke and ignorant. So let me give you a counteroffer." I pointed a finger directly at Richard's chest. "If you ever step foot on my property again, if you ever finance a single hour of Courtney's legal fees against me, I will make a phone call. I will purchase your defaulted commercial debt from Horizon Equity Bank at a premium. I will become your sole creditor, and I will immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings on every single supermarket you own. I will liquidate your entire fake empire, Richard. You will be bagging groceries in a store you used to own." The silence that followed was absolute. The morning birds seemed to have stopped singing. Richard and Eleanor stood frozen on my porch, the reality of my threat crushing the last remnants of their arrogance. They had walked in as predators, and they were leaving as prey. "You cannot do that," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "Try me," I said. I stepped back and slammed the heavy oak door shut, engaging the deadbolt. I watched through the security camera monitor as Richard and Eleanor practically ran back to their Mercedes, the blue confetti of their ruined check still scattered on my porch. They sped away, desperate to escape the trap they had unknowingly walked into. I walked into the kitchen feeling a deep, vibrating sense of satisfaction. I had neutralized Courtney's financial backing. Without her parents' money, she could not afford the sleazy lawyer who orchestrated the fake CPS raid. She was completely isolated. But a narcissist does not surrender when isolated. They escalate. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from Courtney. I picked it up. The screen displayed a photograph. My heart stopped. It was a picture of Layla. She was sitting in what looked like a sterile, brightly lit room. She looked terrified, her eyes red from crying. She was holding a piece of white printer paper. Written on the paper in thick black marker was a message. "Tell Grandpa to send the money." Below the photo was a text from Courtney. "I found out where they are holding her for the emergency placement. I am allowed 1 supervised visit because I am the mother. If you want her out of the system, transfer $200,000 to the offshore account I am sending you. You have until the end of the weekend. Or I will file new abuse charges during my visit and ensure she stays in state custody until she is 18. Courtney was no longer just fighting for assets. She was holding my granddaughter hostage within the legal system. She was weaponizing a child's trauma for a cash ransom. I did not reply to the text. I took a screenshot of the ransom demand, saved the photo of Layla, and immediately forwarded everything to Dominic. This was the final mistake Courtney would ever make. She had just provided federal evidence of extortion and child endangerment. The time for defensive maneuvers was over. It was time to weave the invisible net that would catch her completely. The morning after Courtney sent that ransom photograph, I sat in the polished, soundproof conference room of my private wealth management bank. Dominic sat across from me, his tablet open, his expression grim. I had forwarded him the photo of Layla holding that extortion sign the moment I received it. To any normal person, the image of their terrified grandchild would induce absolute blind panic. But panic is a useless emotion. Panic causes structural failure. I processed that photograph with the cold, lethal precision of a man who was about to dismantle his enemy piece by piece. Dominic explained how Courtney had managed to get her hands on Layla. Despite the looming federal investigation into her and Kendall, no formal indictments had been unsealed yet. The justice system moves meticulously, often agonizingly slow. Courtney's sleazy family court attorney had weaponized this delay. He filed an emergency ex parte motion claiming that Layla was suffering severe psychological distress in the state foster facility, and that Courtney, as her biological mother with no prior criminal convictions on her official record, was entitled to an unsupervised 48-hour visitation weekend to stabilize the child. A sympathetic, overworked family court judge granted the motion before Dominic could intervene. Courtney had exploited a gap in the judicial concrete. She had Layla from Friday evening until Monday morning. And her text message was crystal clear: transfer $200,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands by Sunday night. If I refused, she promised to disappear across the border with my granddaughter, or alternatively fabricate horrifying new abuse charges during her visitation that would ensure Layla stayed trapped in the foster system until she turned 18. She thought she was executing a masterful hostage negotiation. She thought she had found my breaking point. She assumed that, like any desperate grandfather, I would quietly wire the funds to save my family. What she failed to realize was that you do not negotiate with a terrorist. You neutralize them. Dominic leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "We have forwarded the extortion text to the FBI," Dominic said, his voice low. "It is textbook wire fraud and interstate extortion. But federal agents operate on their own timeline. They are building a massive corporate embezzlement case against Kendall, and they will not move on Courtney until they are ready to sweep up the entire network. If she actually tries to run for the border on Sunday night, the authorities might catch her, but it is a massive risk. We need to secure your assets permanently right now before she attempts any further legal maneuvers to freeze your accounts." I nodded. I looked at the lead banker, a senior vice president named Mr. Sterling, who had just entered the room carrying a stack of thick, watermarked legal binders. Sterling treated me with a level of deep, unwavering respect that Courtney and Kendall could never comprehend. Because Courtney and Kendall thought I was just a retired bridge inspector surviving on a modest city pension. They saw my simple clothes, my older truck, and my quiet life, and they assumed I was lower middle class. They had absolutely no idea who I really was or what I had built. During the late 1980s, while working 80-hour weeks to put Kendall through elite private schools, I was not just pouring concrete and inspecting rebar. I was drafting. I was analyzing the catastrophic failures of suspension bridges during seismic events. In 1994, I patented the Rollins seismic damper, a specialized structural joint that absorbs and disperses kinetic shock waves during severe earthquakes. I did not sell the patent to a conglomerate. I licensed it. Every time a major coastal bridge was retrofitted in the United States over the last 30 years, every time a new commercial overpass was constructed in a fault zone, a royalty check was deposited into my private accounts. I had quietly amassed an 8-figure fortune. I was worth over $14 million in liquid capital and compounding investments. I never told Kendall about the money. I wanted him to develop a work ethic. I wanted him to build his own legacy, uncorrupted by the lazy entitlement of unearned wealth. I drove an old truck and lived in the same comfortable, modest house because I did not need a luxury car to validate my existence. Courtney, obsessed with the illusion of wealth, had looked down on a man who could have bought her entire fake social circle with a single wire transfer. Mr. Sterling laid the binders on the mahogany table and slid a gold pen toward me. "Mr. Rollins," Sterling said smoothly. "As requested, these documents will execute an immediate total transfer of your entire portfolio. Your liquid assets, the patent rights, the lake house, and all investment accounts will be moved into an irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is the titanium vault of the financial world. Once the assets are transferred, they cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the permission of the beneficiary. And the sole beneficiary I named on that trust was Layla. I was officially removing my name from my own wealth. From a legal standpoint, Corey Rollins would become a man with zero assets. This was my ultimate defensive maneuver. If Courtney somehow found a corrupt judge to grant her conservatorship over me, she would inherit absolute zero. If she actually managed to have me killed, my will could not be contested because there would be nothing left to contest. The money belonged exclusively to a trust fund that Layla could not access until she was 25 years old, and it was to be heavily guarded by Dominic as the ruthless, uncompromising executor. I picked up the heavy gold pen. I did not hesitate. I signed page after page, initialing every rider and addendum. With every stroke of ink, I was building an impenetrable fortress around my granddaughter's future, completely locking out the parasites who had tried to consume our family. When the final signature was complete, Mr. Sterling gathered the binders, shook my hand firmly, and left the room to process the transfers. The $14 million empire was secured. Dominic closed his tablet and looked at me across the table. "The assets are ghosted," Dominic said. "You are bulletproof. Now what do we do about the ransom demand? You have roughly 48 hours before Courtney expects to see $200,000 sitting in that offshore account. If she does not see the money, she is going to panic." I looked down at my phone. The screen was dark, but the image of Layla crying with that ransom sign was permanently burned into my retinas. Courtney wanted $200,000 to fund her escape. She thought her little luxury fashion boutique was going to be her backup plan, her glossy safety net once she dumped Kendall and started over. "I am not transferring a single cent to her offshore account," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "I am not responding to her text message. Let her sit in the silence and wonder. Let her sweat." Dominic raised an eyebrow. "If you ignore the ransom, she might attempt to flee early." "She cannot flee if she has no legs to run on," I replied coldly. "Courtney's entire identity, her entire ego is wrapped up in that ridiculous luxury boutique. She used stolen corporate funds to sign the lease. She took out high-interest loans from private creditors to stock the shelves with designer inventory. She thinks that store makes her untouchable. I want you to touch it." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table. The defensive fortifications were in place. Now it was time to drop the bombs. "Dominic," I instructed, my eyes locked onto his, "I want you to track down the commercial landlord who owns the retail space where her boutique is located. I want you to track down the private lenders she used to secure her inventory. Use the emergency slush fund we set aside. I do not care what the premium is. I want you to legally purchase the deed to her commercial lease, and I want you to buy up every single cent of her outstanding corporate debt." A slow, predatory smile spread across Dominic's face. He understood exactly what I was building. "You want to become her sole creditor," Dominic clarified, typing rapidly on his tablet. "I do not just want to be her creditor," I corrected him. "I want to be her absolute owner. I want to own the roof over her business, the clothes on her racks, and the debt hanging over her neck. I want you to initiate the financial slaughter of her boutique. Buy the debt today and draft an immediate notice of commercial foreclosure. By the time this weekend is over, I want Courtney to realize that she is not running from me. She is entirely trapped inside a cage that I built." By early Friday afternoon, our private investigator forwarded a live audio and video feed directly to my phone. He had positioned himself at a corner cafe directly across the street from Courtney's prized possession, her luxury fashion boutique. The store, arrogantly named Maison Court, sat on a premium corner of the downtown shopping district. Through the high-definition lens, I watched my daughter-in-law hold court. She was sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the center of her boutique, surrounded by racks of overpriced designer inventory that she did not actually own. 3 of her elite sycophantic friends were gathered around her, sipping sparkling water from crystal flutes. Courtney was playing the role of the tragic, wealthy martyr to absolute perfection. She wiped away non-existent tears, recounting a completely fabricated story about how Kendall had betrayed her and how she was single-handedly fighting to protect her daughter from a hostile, mentally unstable grandfather. She told her friends that she was simply an independent, self-made businesswoman surviving a brutal family tragedy. Her friends cooed in sympathy, validating her toxic delusions. Yet every 30 seconds, Courtney's eyes darted down to the screen of her phone. She would swipe to refresh her banking app, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the screen. She was waiting for the $200,000 wire transfer to hit her offshore account. She honestly believed that her extortion plot had worked. She believed that the quiet, compliant behavior I had shown during the police raid meant I had surrendered. She thought she had broken me. She sat in her leased boutique, surrounded by financed clothes, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth while eagerly waiting for an old man's ransom money to fund her escape. I watched her fake smile stretch across her face as she laughed at a joke one of her friends made. It was a fascinating display of structural failure. She was a building stripped of its load, bearing walls hovering in midair out of sheer ignorance, completely unaware that gravity was about to violently reassert itself. I turned off the video feed and slid my phone into my jacket pocket. Dominic and I did not waste another minute. We left the bank and drove straight to the offices of the commercial real estate firm that managed the downtown district. The landlord, a stern, pragmatic businessman named Arthur Pendleton, received us in his boardroom. Pendleton was a man who cared exclusively about profit margins and risk mitigation. When Dominic laid our proposal on his desk, Pendleton did not even try to hide his relief. Courtney had been an absolute nightmare of a tenant. According to Pendleton, she was habitually late on her lease payments, constantly demanding expensive aesthetic renovations and treating his maintenance staff like indentured servants. She had only secured the prime retail space by forging Kendall's corporate income statements to inflate her financial backing. I did not just offer to pay her back rent. I offered to purchase the entire commercial lease assignment outright, paying a heavy premium from my liquid slush fund to ensure the transaction was executed immediately. Pendleton signed the transfer papers with eager efficiency, happy to wash his hands of a toxic liability. But taking the roof over her head was only the first step. Next, we targeted her inventory. Dominic had pulled the public financial filings for her business. Courtney had stocked her luxury boutique using high-interest, short-term commercial loans from 2 private supply creditors. She had leveraged herself to the absolute limit, banking on the fake prestige of her store to generate quick revenue. We initiated immediate conference calls with both creditors. Private lenders deal in risk, and Courtney's profile was currently flashing bright red. Dominic informed them that Courtney was functionally insolvent and tied to an impending federal embezzlement investigation. Before they could panic, I offered to buy the paper on all of her outstanding debt. I purchased her loans for pennies on the dollar, absorbing the risk in exchange for total, unmitigated control of her financial obligations. The creditors eagerly legally transferred the rights to me, thrilled to escape the blast radius of her impending ruin. Within 3 hours, I had systematically purchased the very ground she stood on and the clothes she sold. The ink dried on the final contracts. I was now officially Courtney's commercial landlord and her sole primary creditor. I owned her business entity completely. We returned to Dominic's law firm as the late afternoon sun began to set. Dominic sat at his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he drafted the most devastating legal documents of Courtney's life. He printed out a formal notice of default, an immediate commercial foreclosure, and a 24-hour eviction mandate. The printer hummed, sliding the crisp white pages into the output tray. Dominic gathered the papers, stapled them, and looked across the desk at me. "We can dispatch a process server to the boutique right now," Dominic said, tapping the stack of documents. "We can have the local sheriff lock the doors, seize the inventory, and throw her out onto the sidewalk before she even closes up shop for the evening." I looked at the foreclosure notice. A sudden, quiet eviction would certainly destroy her business, but it would allow her to retreat into the shadows. It would give her time to spin a new web of lies, to call her elite friends and claim she was unfairly targeted. She had publicly humiliated me in my own kitchen. She had slapped me across the face in front of my granddaughter. A private defeat was far too merciful for a predator of her caliber. "No," I replied calmly. "Do not send the process server. Put those documents in a heavy envelope and hand it to me." Dominic raised an eyebrow, a calculating gleam in his eye, but he did exactly as I asked. He sealed the foreclosure notices inside a thick, unmarked envelope and slid it across the desk. I placed my hand flat over it. "Courtney is hosting a high society charity gala tomorrow night," I explained, recalling the arrogant boasting she had done weeks prior. "She plans to use that event to showcase her fake wealth to the entire city. We are going to let her put on her dress. We are going to let her gather her audience. I will hand-deliver this envelope to her myself, right when the spotlight is burning the brightest." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. When you spend your life calculating the exact limits of steel and concrete, you learn how to handle pressure. You learn that panic is the enemy of stability. Courtney stood on the other side of the kitchen island, her chest heaving, her eyes darting between me and the door. She was waiting for me to yell. She was waiting for me to throw a tantrum to match her chaotic energy so she could play the victim. I gave her absolutely nothing. I unlocked my screen and tapped the contact name for Dominic. Dominic was not just any lawyer, he was a ruthless, brilliant attorney who specialized in asset protection and corporate warfare. I had been paying his retainer for 3 weeks, quietly preparing for the exact moment my son's house of cards collapsed. The line rang twice before he answered. "I need you to initiate Protocol B," I said. My voice was low and clear. "Understood," Corey Dominic replied instantly. "It is done." I hung up. I did not look at Courtney. I did not look at Kendall. I simply opened my contacts again and tapped the name Sylvia. Sylvia was the chief financial officer of the firm where Kendall worked as a senior project manager. She was a woman who dealt in hard numbers and possessed zero tolerance for fraud. The phone connected. "It is time," I told her. "Come over, I will be there in 30 minutes. Sylvia responded. "I have the files in the car." I ended the call and placed my phone face down on the granite countertop. The entire exchange took less than 40 seconds. 2 phone calls, 14 words in total. That was all it took to dismantle the fake empire my daughter-in-law had built. Courtney let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the kitchen walls. She crossed her arms, her acrylic nails digging into the sleeves of her expensive cashmere sweater. "Are you serious right now?" she sneered, stepping closer to me. "Did you just call the police on us? Are you actually calling the cops on your own family because you are too bitter to help us out? You really are pathetic, Corey." "Go ahead. Let the police come. Tell them your daughter-in-law yelled at you. Let us see who they believe. A successful young couple or a bitter old man holding on to a worthless cabin." I did not answer her. I walked past her, pulled out my chair, and sat back down at the dining table. I picked up my mug of black coffee. It had gone completely cold, but I took a slow, deliberate sip anyway. My silence infuriated her more than any insult could have. Narcissists feed on reactions. When you deny them a reaction, they starve and their behavior becomes increasingly erratic. "Fine," Courtney snapped. She spun around and marched toward the living room, grabbing Layla by the wrist. Layla stumbled, her small face streaked with tears, looking back at me with pleading eyes. "Come on, Layla. We are leaving. We are not spending another second in this toxic house with this crazy old man." Courtney began violently shoving Layla's coloring books and markers into her designer tote bag. She moved frantically, tearing through the living room to gather their coats. Kendall finally stood up, but he just hovered awkwardly near the hallway, useless and pathetic, murmuring Courtney's name in a weak attempt to calm her down. She ignored him completely. "You are never going to see her again, Corey." Courtney screamed from the hallway, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Do you hear me? You are dead to us. I will make sure you never get a single phone call, never attend another birthday party, and never spend another Christmas with my granddaughter. You can rot in this empty house with your precious lake house deed. You chose a piece of wood over your own blood." She expected me to break. She expected me to beg her to stay, to plead for access to my granddaughter. She was using a 7-year-old child as a human shield to extort a piece of real estate. It was the ultimate structural failure of her character. I took another sip of my cold coffee. I kept my posture straight, my eyes fixed on the oak table. I did not say a word. I let her scream. I let her hurl every insult she could think of. I let her completely dig her own grave. Every threat she made, every vile word she spat only confirmed that I was making the right decision. You do not negotiate with terrorists, and you do not finance the people who view your love as a weakness to be exploited. The minutes dragged on. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Courtney had packed Layla's backpack and threw it by the front door, but she did not actually leave. She was bluffing. She wanted the confrontation. She paced the living room, checking her phone, muttering curses under her breath, waiting for the imaginary police cruisers to arrive so she could play the weeping victim. She was entirely unaware of the actual storm gathering right above her head. 36 minutes passed. I counted every single one of them by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. 36 minutes of unbearable tension, of Layla quietly sobbing on the sofa, of Kendall standing like a frozen statue, and of Courtney pacing like a caged animal. I watched them with the clinical detachment of a man surveying a condemned building right before the demolition charges detonate. They had spent years chipping away at the load-bearing walls of our family, and they had absolutely no idea that the roof was about to cave in. Then the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the silence. Courtney stopped pacing. She looked out the large front window, her posture instantly shifting from aggressive rage to arrogant triumph. A sleek, black luxury sedan had pulled up to the curb. The sunlight caught the polished hood, making the expensive vehicle gleam. Courtney let out a smug, victorious sigh. She turned to Kendall, who was still hovering near the kitchen counter. "See," she said, her voice dripping with extreme arrogance. "My parents are here. I texted my mother right after he refused to sign the papers. They are coming to get us. They are going to bring their lawyers, and we will see how smug your father acts when he is dealing with people who actually have real money and real power." She grabbed her handbag, threw her shoulders back, and marched toward the front door, eager to welcome her reinforcements. She reached for the brass handle, a triumphant smirk plastered across her face, completely ready to escalate her performance for an audience. But Kendall had also looked out the window. I watched my son's face. I watched the exact second his eyes focused on the black car. I watched all the blood instantly drain from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His jaw went completely slack. His hands, which had been resting on the edge of the kitchen island, began to shake violently. He recognized the license plate. He recognized the make and model of the car. The car door opened outside. The heavy thud echoed all the way into the living room. Courtney swung the front door wide open, her fake high society smile ready to greet who she assumed was her wealthy mother. Kendall did not walk to the door. His knees literally buckled beneath him. He collapsed right there on the kitchen floor, hitting the ceramic tiles with a heavy thud. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders heaving, and he began to sob. It was not a quiet cry. It was a guttural, terrifying sound of absolute, unavoidable ruin. He wept with the sheer panic of a man who knew his entire life, his career, and his freedom were officially over. Courtney's smirk vanished the second she saw the person stepping up onto my porch. Friday evening settled over my house with a cold and quiet intensity. I was sitting at the kitchen island staring at the thick manila envelope Dominic had given me. It contained the financial execution of my daughter-in-law. I was mentally preparing for the confrontation at the gala when the motion sensor on my driveway alarm chimed. I looked at the security monitor. It was Kendall. He looked entirely destroyed. He was not wearing a suit anymore. He wore a rumpled gray hoodie and dirty jeans. He looked like a man who had not slept or eaten in days. He stood on the porch looking frantically over his shoulder, clutching something tightly against his chest. I walked to the front door and opened it just a crack, leaving the heavy chain engaged. "Dad, please." Kendall gasped, his chest heaving as if he had sprinted for miles. "I am not asking for money this time. I am not asking you to save me. I just need you to look at this. Please, you have to see what she is doing." I unlatched the chain and opened the door. Kendall practically stumbled inside, his breathing erratic. He did not ask to sit down. He just held out his trembling hand. Resting in his palm was a cheap black plastic burner phone. It was the kind of disposable device criminals buy with cash to avoid being tracked. "Where did you get that?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. "I found it in her closet," Kendall choked out, swiping a hand across his tear-stained face. "The feds froze our accounts, so we have been living in that cramped apartment she hates. She told me she was going out to meet a lawyer. But when she went into the shower, I saw 2 massive suitcases hidden under the bed. They were fully packed, not just with clothes, but with Layla's birth certificate, social security cards, and her most expensive jewelry." Then I heard a buzzing sound coming from a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet. I opened it and found this phone. Kendall handed the device to me. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped it. I opened it. Kendall whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic sob. I read the messages. "Dad, she is leaving me. She is going to let me burn." I took the burner phone from him. The screen was unlocked. I opened the messaging app. There was only one active text thread saved under a single initial, the letter M. I began to read the messages, scrolling through days of secret correspondence. It did not take a genius to figure out that M stood for Marcus, the aggressive family court attorney Courtney had hired to file the fake dementia charges against me. The messages were vile. They were highly explicit, detailing a graphic and ongoing physical affair between Courtney and her lawyer. She had been sleeping with him to secure his legal services on credit, manipulating him into fast-tracking the emergency custody orders. But the infidelity was not the most dangerous thing on that phone. The real weapon was the logistical planning detailed in the final dozen text messages. I read the words carefully, my blood turning to ice. Courtney was outlining her escape plan. She explicitly told Marcus that she was expecting a wire transfer of $200,000 from me by Sunday night. She laid out the exact steps she would take once the money cleared the offshore account. She instructed Marcus to finalize fraudulent travel documents for her and Layla. She was planning to board a private charter flight to a non-extradition country by Monday morning. And then I saw the message that had completely broken my son. Courtney had written, "The feds are focused entirely on Kendall right now. He is too weak to realize what is happening. By the time they arrest him for the embezzlement on Monday, Layla and I will be gone. He is the perfect fall guy. Let him rot in federal prison." I am taking the old man's money and starting over. I looked up from the glowing screen. Kendall was leaning against the wall, weeping openly, his spirit completely crushed. He had stolen corporate funds. He had alienated his father. He had abandoned his heritage, all to please a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a disposable shield to absorb her federal prison sentence. She never loved him. She only loved what he could steal for her. "I have the burner phone," Kendall stammered, sliding down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. "I took it and ran straight here. She does not know I have it yet. She is going to panic when she gets out of the shower. Dad, she is going to steal Layla. She is going to take my daughter and disappear forever. You have to stop her." I looked at the cheap plastic device in my hand. This was not just a phone. It was the ultimate undeniable leverage. This was federal evidence of flight risk conspiracy fraud and a deeply corrupt legal strategy. It proved that her entire custody claim was a malicious fabrication designed to extort me. Armed with this device, Dominic could not only ensure Courtney was locked away in a federal penitentiary for decades, but he could permanently strip her of every single parental right she possessed. "Get up, Kendall," I commanded. My voice was devoid of sympathy but filled with an iron resolve. "You made your choices and you will face your 10 years in federal prison like a man. You will surrender to the authorities on Monday morning, but I will make sure Courtney does not take my granddaughter anywhere." Kendall nodded weakly, accepting his fate. I told him to go check into a cheap motel and wait for the inevitable. I watched him walk out into the night, a ghost of the son I once knew. I locked the door and placed the burner phone on the kitchen counter right next to the envelope containing her commercial foreclosure documents. The arsenal was complete. I had the financial guillotine, and now I had the legal firing squad. Just as I turned to walk toward my study, my own cell phone chimed on the counter. It was an automated digital notification. I opened my email and found a highly stylized gold and black digital invitation. It was from Courtney. Despite her impending ruin, despite her secret plans to flee the country, she was still playing her twisted public game. The invitation requested my presence at the Maison Court annual charity gala scheduled for the very next evening at the most exclusive ballroom downtown. It was her desperate attempt to maintain her fake high society facade in front of her wealthy friends. At the bottom of the invitation, she had typed a personalized, arrogant note. "Bring the check for $200,000 to the gala. We will do the exchange quietly in the VIP lounge. Do not make me ruin your life, Corey." I stared at the message, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. She was inviting me into her own arena. She wanted to play the powerful socialite one last time. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the city's elite. I tapped the screen and hit accept. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I reached past my everyday clothes and pulled out my finest custom-tailored charcoal suit. The trap was perfectly set, and the guest of honor was ready to attend. Saturday morning arrived with the quiet electric hum of impending execution. Across town, Courtney was undoubtedly in a manic frenzy of hairspray, private caterers, and crystal champagne flutes, completely oblivious to the fact that her secret burner phone was currently sitting on my kitchen island. The Maison Court annual charity gala was her absolute crown jewel. It was an event she had funded entirely through high-interest commercial loans and stolen corporate capital. She threw these extravagant parties under the guise of philanthropy, but the true purpose was always to solidify her standing among the city's wealthy elite. She needed them to look at her with envy. She needed the constant validation to feed her bottomless narcissism. My phone buzzed on the granite countertop, snapping my attention away from my black coffee. It was a text from her regular number sent with the frantic arrogance of a cornered predator who still believes she was the hunter. The message read, "I expect you at the venue by 8 sharp. Bring the cashier's check for the $200,000. Do not try anything stupid, or the emergency custody arrangement becomes permanent. You give me the money, I give you the schedule for Layla. We handle this quietly." She truly believed she was holding all the cards. She honestly thought she was the brilliant puppet master orchestrating an international escape. She had absolutely no idea that the federal authorities had already frozen Kendall's assets, that Dominic held the commercial lease to her entire business, and that her secret communications with her divorce attorney were fully documented and handed over to the FBI. She was a ghost haunting her own life, styling her hair for a party she would inevitably leave in handcuffs. I did not reply to her text. Silence is the most terrifying answer you can give a narcissist. It deprives them of the control and the reaction they desperately crave. I set my phone down and walked toward my study. It was time to coordinate the demolition. I spent the afternoon methodically putting the final pieces of the trap into place. I called Dominic first. He answered on the first ring, the sound of a keyboard clicking echoing in the background. The commercial foreclosure and the eviction mandate are fully finalized. Dominic confirmed, his voice vibrating with predatory satisfaction. I have the physical documents sealed in a heavy black envelope. I will meet you outside the venue at 7:45 to hand them off. I thanked him and immediately dialed Sylvia. As the chief financial officer of Kendall's former firm, she had been working directly with the federal authorities all week to build the embezzlement case. The FBI has reviewed the burner phone data you forwarded last night, Sylvia stated, her tone entirely stripped of emotion. The flight risk is undeniable. Because Courtney outlined a specific timeline to flee the country with your granddaughter by Monday morning, the federal prosecutor has fast-tracked the arrest warrant. They are not waiting for Monday. The agents are assembling tonight. What is their exact operational timeline? I asked, leaning against my mahogany desk. They want to minimize collateral damage in a crowded ballroom, Sylvia explained. They will secure the perimeter of the venue by 8:15. Plainclothes agents will lock down the valet and the service exits. They are waiting for her to take the stage for her keynote speech. It creates a centralized target, completely isolates her from the crowd, and prevents her from attempting to flee through a side door. It was a flawlessly synchronized operation. Dominic would provide the financial execution, the FBI would provide the criminal execution, and I would be the one to look her in the eye when the floor collapsed beneath her feet. I showered, shaved, and began to dress. I put on a crisp white shirt and fastened a dark silk tie. I slipped on the custom-tailored charcoal suit I had pulled from my closet the night before. The heavy fabric settled perfectly onto my shoulders. This was not just a suit, it was armor. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. I did not look like the tired, compliant grandfather Courtney had slapped in the kitchen. I looked like a man who had built bridges out of steel, a man who possessed $14 million in liquid capital and the lethal patience required to use it. I checked my gold watch. It was time to attend the gala. I pulled into the valet line of the downtown Grand Ballroom at exactly 7:45. The crisp evening air bit at my face as I stepped out of my truck. Dominic was waiting near the entrance, leaning casually against a marble pillar. Without a single word, he stepped forward and slid a thick, heavy black envelope into my inner jacket pocket. The foreclosure documents rested heavily against my chest. Dominic gave me a single sharp nod and walked away into the night, his part of the mission complete. I handed my keys to the valet and stepped through the towering glass doors. The ballroom was an overwhelming display of manufactured opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests dressed in sharp tuxedos and expensive designer gowns. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters circulated through the room carrying silver trays of champagne and caviar. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the loud, obnoxious laughter of people desperate to prove their social relevance. As I walked down the grand carpeted staircase, the atmosphere around me instantly shifted. I was a 69-year-old African-American man stepping into a sea of elite, predominantly white privilege. I saw the subtle sneers. I felt the cold, judgmental glares darting my way from the cocktail tables. They looked at my dark skin, my silver hair, and my silent demeanor, and they immediately dismissed me as a lost driver, an out-of-place relative, or a charity case. They had absolutely no idea my net worth eclipsed almost everyone in that room combined. I ignored their fragile microaggressions, letting my eyes scan the crowded room until I found her. Courtney was standing near the center stage, draped in a stunning, backless emerald silk gown. She was laughing loudly, holding a champagne flute surrounded by her wealthy sycophants. She looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. Then her eyes locked onto mine. The fake, radiant smile vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a flash of genuine panic. She had expected me to walk in looking defeated, broken, and desperate to hand over the ransom money. Instead, I stood at the bottom of the stairs, radiating absolute, uncompromising authority. She excused herself aggressively, pushing past her wealthy friends without apologizing. Her heels clicked furiously against the polished marble floor as she marched straight toward me. She did not greet me. She grabbed my arm with a painful, desperate grip, her acrylic nails digging into the sleeve of my suit jacket. She yanked me forcefully away from the glittering crowd, dragging me into a dimly lit private alcove near the coat check. "You are late," Courtney hissed, her eyes darting frantically around to make sure none of her high society friends were watching her interact with me. "Where is the cashier's check, Corey? Give me the money right now, or I swear to God I will make sure Layla forgets your name. Hand over the envelope." Courtney's grip on my arm was surprisingly strong, fueled by a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and desperation. She shoved me into the shadows of the coat-check alcove, aggressively pulling me away from the glittering chandeliers and the prying eyes of her wealthy guests. The heavy velvet curtains muffled the soft classical music playing in the main ballroom. The air in the small space was thick with the scent of her overpowering, expensive floral perfume. She spun around to face me, her emerald silk gown rustling sharply against the carpet. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. She took in my custom-tailored charcoal suit, assuming it was some cheap rental I had scraped together to blend into her world. She could not fathom that the fabric draped across my shoulders cost more than her monthly car payment. "You actually wore that?" She spat, her voice a venomous whisper echoing in the confined space. "You look like a retired janitor trying to sneak into a country club." "I told you to come in through the service entrance, Corey. You are embarrassing me in front of the board of directors. Do you have any idea who is in that room right now?" I did not react to the insult. I simply looked at her, a woman whose entire existence was a carefully constructed, heavily financed lie. "Where is the money?" she demanded, holding out her hand, palm up, rubbing her fingers together impatiently. "Hand over the cashier's check right now. $200,000, just like we agreed. Do not try to negotiate with me. You give me the check. I verify the routing numbers on my banking app, and then I will text my mother. She is waiting in the parking garage with Layla right now. You get your precious granddaughter back for the weekend, and I get what I am owed. We handle this quietly, and I will not call the police to report you for trespassing." It was a fascinating performance. She was lying through her teeth without a single hesitation. Her mother was not in the parking garage. Layla was not waiting in a car. Courtney had absolutely no intention of handing over my granddaughter. She was going to take my money stall for time and board a private charter flight to a non-extradition country by Monday morning, leaving Kendall to take the fall for her embezzlement and leaving Layla trapped in the chaos of the foster system. She thought I was a naive, desperate old man willing to pay any ransom just to see his family again. She thought she was the smartest person in the room. I reached into my inner jacket pocket. My movements were slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of the panic she expected to see. I bypassed the heavy black envelope Dominic had given me outside the venue. That one remained securely pressed against my chest, waiting for its designated moment on the stage. Instead, I pulled out a thick, heavy white envelope. It was a package I had printed myself from the files secured on her hidden burner phone. I held the envelope out to her. Courtney snatched it from my hand with the frantic greed of a starving animal. She did not even look at my face. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the thick package, her breathing shallow and rapid. She tore open the flap, her acrylic nails ripping the paper in her haste to extract the cashier's check she believed would buy her permanent freedom. She pulled out the stack of papers. The arrogant, triumphant sneer on her face vanished in an absolute instant. It did not fade slowly. It was eradicated, wiped clean by a shockwave of pure, unadulterated terror. When a massive load-bearing pillar shatters the building, does not sway. It simply drops. I watched Courtney drop. She was not looking at a check from my private wealth management bank. She was looking at high-resolution, color-printed screenshots of every single text message she had sent to Marcus, her aggressive divorce attorney. The very top page displayed a graphic, explicit conversation detailing their ongoing physical affair. The second page outlined her explicit instructions to frame Kendall for the stolen corporate funds, calling her husband a disposable shield. The third page was the fatal blow. It was a printed copy of her confirmed flight itinerary. A private charter booked for Monday morning at 6 o'clock, flying directly out of the country with 2 passenger names listed, hers and Layla's. Courtney's hands began to shake violently. The papers rattled loudly against each other. Her skin, previously glowing with expensive cosmetics and absolute confidence, turned the color of wet ash. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic horror. The air completely left her lungs. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords refused to function. She was paralyzed. "You forgot your burner phone in a shoebox at the apartment," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, unforgiving pitch. "Kendall found it. He brought it straight to me. I know about Marcus. I know about the private charter flight. And more importantly, the Federal Bureau of Investigation knows about the flight." Courtney staggered backward, her emerald heels catching on the carpet. She hit the wall of the alcove, the papers slipping from her trembling fingers and scattering across the floor. "No," she gasped, shaking her head frantically, her perfectly manicured hands grasping at the air. "No, no, you cannot have this. This is illegal. You hacked me. You tried to ransom my granddaughter to fund your escape, I replied, stepping closer, trapping her in the shadows of the alcove. You thought you could outsmart me, Courtney. You thought my silence was weakness. You are not flying anywhere on Monday morning. You are not taking Layla. Your extortion plot is officially over. Courtney pressed her hands against her head, her perfectly styled hair beginning to fray as she spiraled into a total catastrophic meltdown. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she desperately tried to formulate a new lie, a new manipulation to claw her way out of the trap. She looked at the papers scattered on the floor, the tangible evidence of her ruined life, and then stared wildly at the heavy velvet curtains. But there was no exit. The reinforced concrete walls of reality had finally closed in on her, and there was absolutely no escape from the crush of her own consequences. Before she could scream, before she could launch herself at me or fall to her knees and beg for mercy, a booming, cheerful voice echoed through the hidden speakers of the alcove. The soft classical music in the main ballroom had abruptly stopped. Ladies and gentlemen, the amplified voice of the gala's master of ceremonies announced, ringing with unearned prestige. If you could all please direct your attention to the center stage, it is my absolute honor to introduce the visionary behind tonight's magnificent event. A woman who truly embodies the spirit of philanthropy, community leadership, and uncompromising family values. Please put your hands together for the owner of Maison Court, our very own Courtney Rollins. Thunderous applause erupted from the ballroom. Hundreds of wealthy guests, the very people Courtney was so desperate to impress, were clapping, waiting for their queen to address them. They were completely unaware that the woman they were cheering for was functionally bankrupt and minutes away from a federal indictment. Courtney froze. She looked toward the heavy velvet curtains separating us from the stage, her eyes welling with terrified tears, then looked back at me. She was a woman standing on the gallows, hearing her name called for the execution block. I stepped back, clearing the path to the curtains. I gestured politely toward the bright lights of the ballroom waiting just beyond the fabric. "They are waiting for you," I whispered, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "Go on, give them a show." Courtney's breathing was shallow and ragged. The applause from the ballroom was a deafening roar, pulling her toward the light like a massive, unavoidable tractor beam. She looked down at the scattered papers on the floor of the alcove, the undeniable printed proof of her ruined escape plan, and then stared back at me. Her survival instinct, honed by years of manipulating every social situation to her advantage, desperately tried to kick in. She smoothed the front of her emerald silk gown with trembling hands. She forced her facial muscles into a rigid plastic smile that completely failed to reach her terrified, bloodshot eyes. She stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains and walked into the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. The crowd erupted into louder applause as she climbed the short carpeted steps to the center stage. I followed her out of the shadows, walking at a steady, measured pace. I bypassed the crowded cocktail tables and took a seat directly in the center of the front row. I crossed my legs, rested my hands on my knees, and watched her. Courtney reached the clear acrylic podium. The bright stage spotlight hit her directly, illuminating the fine sheen of panic sweat rapidly forming on her forehead. She gripped the outer edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles turned completely white against the plastic. She looked out over the sea of wealthy socialites, the very people she had stolen from her husband's company to impress. Then her eyes darted down and locked onto mine. I was sitting less than 10 feet away. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and slowly pulled out the heavy black envelope Dominic had given me outside the venue. I rested it squarely on my lap. "Thank you," Courtney began. Her voice, usually so loud and commanding, cracked weakly over the sound system. A high-pitched screech of audio feedback echoed through the massive speakers, causing several guests in the front rows to wince and cover their ears. She swallowed hard, trying to regain her fragile composure. "Thank you all for coming tonight to support the Maison Court Foundation. Tonight is about giving back. It is about community, and most importantly, it is about family values." The hypocrisy of her words tasted like ash in the air. A woman who had just planned to flee the country with stolen funds and a kidnapped child was actively lecturing the city elite on family values. She stumbled over her next sentence, losing her place on her cue cards. She stuttered, her eyes repeatedly darting back to the black envelope resting on my lap. We believe that true wealth is measured by what we give to others. And my husband Kendall and I have always strived to be pillars of support for those who are struggling to build their own foundations. She was visibly hyperventilating now. The polished, refined persona was physically melting off her face. The wealthy guests began to exchange confused, uncomfortable glances. The polite applause had died down entirely, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. They could literally smell the panic radiating from the stage. I did not let her suffer in silence any longer. It was time to pull the final support column and let gravity do the rest. I uncrossed my legs and stood up. The movement drew the immediate attention of the entire front row. Sharp whispers rippled through the crowd as a 69-year-old African-American man in a custom charcoal suit began walking purposefully toward the stage stairs. Courtney stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she watched me ascend the carpeted steps. She tried to step back from the podium, but her emerald high heels caught on the thick black microphone cable winding across the floor. She was completely paralyzed. I stepped onto the stage, walking directly into the blinding glare of the spotlight. I did not rush. I moved with the absolute authority of a man who owned the very ground we were standing on. I reached the podium and stood shoulder to shoulder with my daughter-in-law. She was shaking so violently I could hear the expensive fabric of her gown rustling against the microphone stand. I held out the heavy black envelope. She did not want to take it, but the overwhelming pressure of hundreds of eyes watching her forced her hand. She reached out with trembling, sweaty fingers and took the envelope. I did not step away. Instead, I reached out and took the microphone directly from her shaking hand. The ballroom fell dead silent. You could hear a pin drop on the polished marble floors in the back of the room. I looked out over the sea of arrogant, privileged faces. "Good evening," I said. My voice resonated through the massive speakers, deep calm and carrying an unshakable command. Since Courtney is up here discussing charity and family values, I think it is the perfect time for a public announcement. I turned my head slightly to look at Courtney. She was staring at the black envelope in her hands as if it were a live grenade on the verge of detonating. "My name is Corey Rollins," I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. "I am Courtney's father-in-law, and as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, I am also her sole commercial creditor. I recently purchased the primary lease to the Maison Court boutique. I purchased every single high-interest corporate loan she used to stock her shelves. I also purchased the commercial rental agreement for this exact ballroom for tonight's event." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Women in heavy diamond necklaces covered their mouths in shock. Men in expensive tuxedos leaned forward in their chairs, utterly captivated by the brutal reality unfolding on the stage in front of them. I turned my body completely toward Courtney. The microphone captured every single syllable I spoke. "You are completely insolvent, Courtney," I stated clearly, ensuring the entire room heard her financial execution. "The envelope you are holding contains an immediate commercial foreclosure notice and a 24-hour eviction mandate. You do not own your business. You do not own your inventory. You do not even own the right to stand on this stage tonight. You are financially liquidated." The silence in the ballroom shattered into a chaotic roar of whispers and shocked exclamations. The socialites Courtney had spent years desperately trying to impress were now pulling out their smartphones, pointing their glowing camera lenses directly at her. The elite crowd she worshipped was actively recording her total humiliating destruction. Courtney looked down at the black envelope, then looked out at the sea of flashing cameras. Her high society facade completely disintegrated. The illusion of the wealthy, untouchable boutique owner evaporated, leaving behind a cornered, desperate fraud who had run out of other people's money to spend. She let out a shriek. It was not a word. It was a guttural, ugly, animalistic sound of pure, unhinged rage. She dropped the black envelope, raised her hands with her fingers curled like claws, and lunged directly at me. Her manicured acrylic nails aimed straight for my face, her teeth bared in a feral, desperate grimace. She completely forgot where she was. She forgot the cameras, the wealthy guests, the social standing, and the expensive dress. She just wanted to tear me apart for destroying her fabricated world. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to block her. I simply pivoted my body sideways, stepping out of her direct path with the fluid, calculated motion of a man sidestepping a falling brick. Courtney's own momentum carried her violently forward. She missed me entirely, her emerald heels slipping wildly on the polished wood of the stage. She crashed hard into the clear acrylic podium, knocking it over with a loud, violent crash before tumbling awkwardly onto the floor in a tangled mess of green silk and exposed panic. She scrambled frantically on the floor, screaming obscenities, trying to get back to her feet to launch a second physical attack. The crowd was in an absolute uproar. Security guards at the back of the room were blowing their whistles frantically, trying to push their way through the throng of shocked guests to reach the stage. I stood above her, looking down at the wreckage of her arrogance, perfectly calm. I did not need to raise my voice. The financial demolition was complete, the criminal demolition was just arriving. Courtney scrambled up from the polished wood of the stage, her emerald silk gown torn at the hem and twisted around her knees. She did not care about the hundreds of smartphones actively recording her catastrophic breakdown. Her eyes were entirely feral, completely stripped of the refined high society mask she had spent years carefully curating. She let out a second ear-piercing scream and lunged at me again, using her acrylic nails like weapons aimed directly at my eyes. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly rigid, anticipating the exact trajectory of her strike. She was inches from my face. I could feel the frantic heat of her breath, the desperate swipe of her hand cutting through the air. But before her nails could make contact with my skin, a massive concussive boom rattled the crystal chandeliers hanging high above us. The heavy brass-handled double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom were kicked violently open. The thick oak slammed against the plaster walls with the deafening force of a detonating bomb. The high society crowd gasped in unison, scattering like frightened birds. The security guards at the back of the room stopped blowing their whistles and instantly froze in place, raising their hands in the air. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical vests emblazoned with bright yellow letters swarmed into the opulent space. Their heavy combat boots pounded a synchronized, terrifying rhythm against the marble floor, completely drowning out the string quartet which had abruptly stopped playing. "Federal agents!" The lead officer barked, his voice easily, overpowering the panicked murmurs of the elite guests. "Nobody move. Stay exactly where you are. Keep your hands visible." The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a perfectly squared jaw and a tactical radio secured to his shoulder, locked his eyes directly onto the stage. He did not even glance at the wealthy socialites cowering behind their cocktail tables. He marched straight down the center aisle, moving with lethal, uncompromising purpose. Sylvia's operational timeline was flawless. The trap had closed with absolute mechanical precision. Courtney froze in midair. Her hand, which was a fraction of an inch from scratching my face, dropped heavily to her side. The adrenaline fueling her violent rage instantly evaporated, replaced by the freezing, paralyzing terror of a trapped animal, realizing the steel jaws have snapped shut. She looked at the advancing agents, then darted her eyes frantically toward the emergency exits, but plainclothes officers had already sealed every single door in the building. There was absolutely nowhere to run. The reinforced concrete walls of reality had finally closed in on her. The lead agent ascended the carpeted stairs to the stage, never breaking eye contact with my daughter-in-law, Courtney Rollins. He announced, his voice carrying the immovable weight of the federal government. He reached to his tactical belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "You are under arrest." Courtney began to stammer, shaking her head frantically, stepping backward until her spine hit the velvet curtains. No, there is a massive mistake. I am a business owner. I am hosting a recognized charity gala. I have done nothing wrong. You want my husband. You want Kendall Rollins. He is the one who handles the corporate finances. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, the agent commanded, completely ignoring her pathetic attempt to throw my son under the bus yet again. The federal prosecutor has expedited this warrant based on undeniable documentary evidence of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and an active documented conspiracy to commit international flight to evade prosecution. Courtney gasped, the remaining color completely draining from her face, leaving her skin a ghastly shade of gray. Flight. No, I was not going anywhere. I have a daughter. The agent grabbed her by the shoulder, violently spinning her around and snapping the cold steel cuffs securely around her wrists with a sharp metallic click. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom, a definitive period at the end of her luxurious lies. "We have your burner phone, Courtney," the agent stated flatly, tightening the restraints against her wrists. "We have the encrypted text messages to your divorce attorney. We have the offshore routing numbers. We have the private charter flight itinerary booked for Monday morning. Your husband handed the device directly to the authorities last night. You are not flying anywhere. You are going to a federal holding facility." The realization that Kendall, the man she had treated as a disposable pawn, the man she planned to leave rotting in a cell while she escaped with my money, had delivered the fatal blow, completely shattered her mind. Courtney began to sob. Her knees buckled her body, going entirely limp as two federal agents flanked her, physically holding her upright by her arms. They marched her down the stage steps and directly up the center aisle. Hundreds of camera flashes illuminated her tear-stained, ruined face. The elite guests, the very people she had stolen money to impress, were now documenting her ultimate humiliation. As she was dragged past the front row, she desperately searched the crowd for a single lifeline. She locked eyes with Richard and Eleanor, her arrogant parents, who had tried to bribe me with a worthless $50,000 check just 24 hours prior. "Mom, Dad, do something," Courtney wailed, her voice cracking, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. "Call your lawyers. Help me. Tell them who we are." But Richard and Eleanor did not stand up. They did not shout at the federal agents. They did not flex their supposed social standing. Instead, Richard quickly turned his back, raising his hand to shield his face from the glowing smartphone cameras recording the scene. Eleanor stared fixedly at the floor, actively pretending she had absolutely no relation to the weeping handcuffed felon being paraded through the ballroom. I watched them from the stage. I knew exactly why they remained silent. They were drowning in their own massive commercial debt. They knew that associating with a highly publicized federal embezzlement scandal would trigger an immediate panic among their creditors and completely destroy their failing regional supermarket chain. They abandoned their daughter in her darkest moment with the exact same cold, calculated self-preservation she had planned to use on Kendall. She was learning the hardest lesson of the fake elite world she worshipped. When the money disappears, the loyalty instantly evaporates. I stood on the stage and watched the heavy double doors close behind the federal agents. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers outside briefly painted the ballroom walls through the glass facade. The silence in the venue was absolute, heavy with the stench of shattered illusions. I smoothly adjusted my silk tie and buttoned my charcoal suit jacket. The financial demolition was finalized. The criminal demolition was executed. My work here was entirely finished. I stepped down from the stage, walking right past the frozen, terrified faces of the city elite. None of them dared to make eye contact with me. They parted like the Red Sea, stepping aside to let the older black man in the tailored suit pass through their ranks. I walked out through a quiet side exit into the crisp, cool night air. The city streets were calm. I pulled my keys from my pocket and walked toward my truck. The hurricane had ripped the foundation from the earth and the toxic structure was utterly destroyed. Now I had to drive to the state facility, present my pristine psychological evaluation, and bring my granddaughter home. That same night, I drove my truck directly from the gala to the state foster facility. I walked into the brightly lit administrative office and slid Dr. Thorne's notarized psychological evaluation across the counter along with the emergency release mandate Dominic had meticulously drafted. Within an hour, Layla was safely buckled into the backseat of my truck, fast asleep, clutching her stuffed bear. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that the toxic storm threatening her childhood had been permanently neutralized. The structural integrity of her life was secure. 3 weeks later, the final debris of that storm was swept into the sterile, fluorescent-lit arena of the county family court. I sat at the petitioner's table beside Dominic. The heavy oak benches and the hushed, formal atmosphere of the courtroom felt like a completely different universe compared to the glittering crystal chandeliers of the charity gala. But the stakes here were infinitely higher. We were not dealing with commercial leases or offshore accounts today. We were dealing with the permanent custody of my granddaughter. The heavy side door of the courtroom opened and a bailiff escorted Courtney inside. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. The arrogant, untouchable socialite in the emerald silk gown was entirely gone. Courtney shuffled into the courtroom wearing a drab, oversized Orange County Jail jumpsuit. Her wrists were secured in heavy steel handcuffs attached to a thick leather waist belt. Her designer blonde hair was frizzy, the dark roots growing out sharply pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. The expensive cosmetics that used to mask her true nature had washed away, leaving her skin pale, blotchy, and hollow. She looked exactly like what she was, a cornered, desperate federal inmate facing decades behind bars. She took a seat next to her overworked, exhausted public defender. She could not afford the sleazy, high-priced family lawyer she had previously used, especially since that same lawyer was now facing his own severe ethical investigations, thanks to the text messages we had handed over to the authorities. Judge Abernathy, a stern, no-nonsense woman with decades of experience on the bench, called the hearing to order. She looked down at the massive stack of files sitting on her desk, adjusting her reading glasses with a deep, weary sigh. Before Dominic could even present our opening statement, Courtney's survival instinct frantically misfired. Ignoring the frantic whispers of her public defender, she stood up, her handcuffs clinking loudly against the wooden table. "Your Honor, please," Courtney sobbed. Her tears flowed instantly, a practiced, weaponized display of victimhood. "You have to listen to me. This entire situation is a setup. That man, Corey Rollins, he orchestrated all of this. He is a multimillionaire pretending to be a poor old man. He manipulated my husband into stealing corporate funds, and then he used his hidden wealth to buy my business and ruin my reputation. He framed me to the FBI. He is trying to steal my daughter from me out of pure malicious spite. I am a good mother. I am a victim of his financial abuse." I sat perfectly still, observing her with the clinical detachment of an engineer watching a condemned building groan under its own weight. It was a fascinating display of narcissistic delusion. Even wearing a prison uniform facing undeniable federal evidence, she still honestly believed she could manipulate the room with a few fake tears and a fabricated narrative. Judge Abernathy did not look moved. She looked irritated. She banged her gavel sharply against the sounding block. "Sit down and remain silent, Ms. Rollins," the judge commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. "You will speak through your appointed counsel, or you will be removed from this courtroom and held in contempt." Courtney sank back into her chair, her chest heaving, shooting a venomous, hateful glare in my direction. Dominic stood up, buttoning his tailored navy suit jacket. He did not raise his voice. He did not engage with Courtney's theatrical outburst. He operated with the cold, lethal precision of a surgeon excising a tumor. "Your Honor," Dominic began smoothly, "opposing counsel's client is currently residing in federal custody without the possibility of bail due to an extreme documented flight risk. We are here today to ensure she is never legally permitted to use her biological child as a hostage or an extortion tool ever again." Dominic picked up a thick binder from our table and handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge's bench. "Exhibit A," Dominic stated. "The sworn affidavit filed by Ms. Rollins 3 weeks ago claiming my client suffered from severe dementia and posed a physical threat to the child. Attached to that affidavit is the video evidence submitted to the district attorney showing Ms. Rollins handing a cash bribe to Dr. Eris Thorne to falsify that exact medical diagnosis. She attempted to use this court to strip my client of his civil rights and kidnap his granddaughter under the guise of medical concern." Judge Abernathy flipped open the binder, her eyes narrowing as she read the transcripts of the bribery investigation. Exhibit B. Dominic continued, not giving Courtney a single second to breathe. The financial forensics detailing the massive corporate embezzlement executed by her husband, Kendall Rollins, which funded Ms. Rollins's luxury lifestyle. She was fully complicit in laundering those stolen funds through her commercial boutique. But the fatal blow, the absolute total destruction of Courtney's maternal rights, was still sitting on our table. Dominic picked up a sealed plastic evidence bag containing printed transcripts. Exhibit C. Dominic said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. The data recovered from a secret burner phone hidden in Ms. Rollins's closet. Courtney gasped audibly. Her public defender put a hand over his face, realizing his client had lied to him about the depth of her crimes. These text messages were sent directly from Ms. Rollins to her former attorney. Dominic read aloud for the official court record. I quote, "The feds are focused entirely on Kendall right now. He is too weak to realize what is happening. By the time they arrest him for the embezzlement on Monday, Layla and I will be gone. He is the perfect fall guy. Let him rot in federal prison. I am taking the old man's money and starting over." End quote. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. You could hear the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Dominic looked directly at the judge. She explicitly planned to abandon her husband to face federal prison alone. She demanded a $200,000 ransom from my client, threatening to fabricate new abuse charges against him if he refused to pay. And she booked a private charter flight to a non-extradition country, intending to drag a 7-year-old child into a life of international felony evasion. She does not view Layla as a daughter, Your Honor. She views her as a prop, a shield, and a bargaining chip. Judge Abernathy closed the binder. She took off her reading glasses and stared down at Courtney. The judge's face was a mask of absolute unadulterated disgust. "I have presided over family court for 22 years, Judge Abernathy said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "I have seen addiction, negligence, and severe incompetence, but I have rarely witnessed a display of maternal manipulation as deeply disturbing, cold-blooded, and sociopathic as the one presented in this courtroom today. Ms. Rollins, you attempted to weaponize the judicial system to rob an innocent man, and you actively plotted to kidnap your own child to evade federal prosecution." Courtney began to shake violently, her chains rattling against the wooden table. Therefore, Judge Abernathy announced, her voice booming with absolute finality. I am stripping Courtney Rollins of all legal and physical parental rights effective immediately. Furthermore, I am granting full sole and permanent physical and legal custody of the minor child Layla Rollins to her grandfather Corey Rollins. Ms. Rollins is barred from any supervised or unsupervised visitation. This court is adjourned. The judge slammed her gavel down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The illusion was dead. The manipulation was legally eradicated. Courtney lost her mind. The reality of her total, absolute ruin finally crashed down on her. No, Courtney shrieked, launching herself out of her chair. The heavy steel waist belt jerked her back, but she thrashed wildly against the restraints. You cannot do this to me. I am her mother. She is my daughter. You cannot let him take her. He ruined my life. Corey, you ruined my life. Two bailiffs immediately grabbed her by the arms, dragging her away from the table. She kicked and screamed, her voice tearing through the courtroom in a raw, animalistic display of sheer panic. I stood up from the petitioner's table, buttoning my suit jacket. I looked at her as the bailiffs wrestled her toward the heavy side doors. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. You do not feel pity for the hurricane that tries to wash away your home. You simply fortify the walls and watch it blow itself out into nothing. I will kill you, Courtney screamed as the bailiffs forced her through the doorway, her voice echoing down the concrete hallway of the holding cells until the heavy steel door slammed shut behind her. The courtroom fell silent again. Dominic packed his briefcase, snapping the latches shut. He looked at me and offered a brief, respectful nod. The legal slaughter of the woman who had tried to destroy my family was finalized. Now there was only one loose end left to tie. I had to go visit the prison and look my son in the eye for the very last time. 2 weeks after the family court ruling, I drove 3 hours north to the Federal Correctional Institution. The landscape changed from rolling green hills to stark, unforgiving concrete and razor wire. Kendall had pleaded guilty to corporate embezzlement to avoid a protracted trial. The judge handed him a 5-year sentence in a minimum security facility. He was no longer a senior project manager playing a fake aristocrat. He was federal inmate number 84721. I parked my truck, walked through the sterile security checkpoints, and took my seat in the visitor center. A thick pane of reinforced plexiglass separated the free world from the consequences of absolute greed. The heavy metal door on the inmate side buzzed open. Kendall walked into the visitation room. The transformation was jarring. The tailored designer suits he bought with stolen money were gone, replaced by baggy, faded khaki prison scrubs. His shoulders, which he used to throw back with unearned arrogance, were completely slumped. He looked 10 years older, his face hollow, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He sat down in the plastic chair across from me and picked up the heavy black telephone receiver. I picked up my receiver. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I looked at the man on the other side of the glass. I searched for the boy I had raised, the son I had sacrificed my own youth to protect. But that boy was gone. Kendall broke the silence. He started weeping instantly, his chest heaving with deep, jagged sobs. Dad, he choked out, pressing his forehead against the plexiglass. I am so sorry. I am so sorry for everything. It is a nightmare in here. I lost my job. I lost my reputation. I lost my entire life. He rambled frantically, blaming Courtney for pushing him, blaming the corporate culture, pleading for a sliver of sympathy. He talked about how he would behave perfectly, get out on parole in 3 years, and come back to my house. He begged me to bring Layla to visit him, promising he would be a real father to her once he served his time. He was asking me to preserve his place in our family, to act as his emotional safety net while he waited out his punishment. He wanted me to tell him that everything would go back to normal. I listened to him cry. I felt a profound, finalized grief settle into my bones. As a structural engineer, I know that you cannot rebuild a collapsed bridge using the exact same compromised steel that caused the disaster. The metal is fatigued. It will fail again the second a new load is applied. Kendall was fatigued metal. If I allowed him to lean on me, if I gave him the false hope that he could simply resume his position in Layla's life without fundamentally rebuilding his own character from scratch, I would be setting my granddaughter up for a catastrophic collapse. I kept my voice incredibly steady, projecting the calm, unshakable foundation he desperately lacked. Kendall, listen to me, I said. He stopped rambling, looking up at me with tear-stained eyes, desperate for absolution. I love you. You are my son, and I will always carry the memory of the boy you were. I forgive you for the disrespect, and I forgive you for standing by while that woman struck me in my own home. Kendall let out a shaky breath of relief, but I did not let him speak. I forgive you, I continued, my tone dropping to a firm, immovable register, but I will never trust you again. You traded your integrity for an illusion. You abandoned your duty as a father to appease a parasite. I will take perfect care of Layla, but I will not bring her to this prison, and I will not hold a space for you in our lives when you get out. You must become a man on your own. You must learn to bear your own weight." I gently placed the telephone receiver back onto the cradle. Kendall screamed my name, slamming his hands against the thick plexiglass, his face twisted in absolute devastation. I stood up, turned my back to the glass, and walked out of the visitation room. I did not look back. The toxic dependency was permanently severed. While Kendall was forced to face the quiet, crushing reality of his own weakness, Courtney was experiencing a much more violent destruction of her fabricated universe. She was transferred to a federal women's penitentiary to begin serving a lengthy sentence for wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit international flight. The luxurious, manicured world of Maison Court was entirely eradicated. The reality of federal prison stripped away every single layer of her fake superiority. There were no designer emerald gowns, no crystal champagne flutes, and no private alcoves. Courtney was forced to wear a stiff, scratchy orange jumpsuit that hung awkwardly on her frame. The expensive highlights in her blonde hair grew out into dull, greasy roots. The elaborate cosmetics she used to hide her insecurities were confiscated. Without her makeup, her false eyelashes, and her tailored clothes, she looked remarkably ordinary, pale, exhausted, and completely stripped of her power. However, narcissism is a stubborn disease. In the first few weeks, Courtney desperately tried to maintain her elite persona. During a recreation period in the crowded, echoing cafeteria, she attempted to assert dominance over a table of hardened inmates. She scoffed at the institutional food and demanded that a woman sitting across from her move out of her line of sight, using the exact same arrogant, commanding tone she used to belittle her boutique employees. She barked, "You are sitting in my space. Move. Do you have any idea who I am?" The other inmate, a woman who had survived entirely without the safety net of wealthy parents, did not flinch. She simply stood up, grabbed Courtney by the collar of her oversized orange jumpsuit, and slammed her roughly against the concrete wall. The inmate leaned in close and whispered, "Nobody cares who you were on the outside, princess. In here you are absolutely nothing." The correctional officers intervened before it escalated into a full brawl, but the damage to Courtney's ego was permanent and devastating. She was publicly put in her place entirely defenseless. Because of her abrasive behavior and complete inability to follow basic instructions, the prison administration assigned her to the most grueling, humiliating work detail available, laundry duty. The woman who once prided herself on selling $1,000 silk dresses was now forced to spend 8 hours a day in a windowless, steaming concrete basement. She had to haul massive, soaking wet bags of stained bed sheets and soiled prison uniforms. The harsh industrial detergent ruined her hands, blistering her skin and cracking her expensive acrylic nails down to the quick. It was the ultimate poetic destruction of her vanity. But the final fatal blow did not come from the prison guards or the other inmates. It arrived during the evening mail call. A guard handed Courtney a crisp, heavy envelope bearing the official letterhead of a high-powered corporate law firm. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. She honestly believed it was a lifeline from her parents, Richard and Eleanor. She thought they had finally secured a high-priced appellate attorney to rescue her from this nightmare. She unfolded the thick parchment paper. It was not a legal defense strategy. It was a formal declaration of abandonment. Because of the massive federal scandal she had caused and the aggressive financial foreclosure I had initiated against their commercial debts, the Vance regional supermarket chain was filing for bankruptcy. To salvage whatever small fraction of their social and financial standing they had left, Richard and Eleanor Vance had legally severed all ties with their daughter. The letter explicitly stated that she was permanently removed from the family trust and that they would not accept any phone calls or correspondence from the federal penitentiary. Courtney stood in the damp, sweltering heat of the prison laundry room, holding the paper in her blistered hands. She had no money, no husband, no child, and now no parents. The absolute crushing weight of total isolation finally caved in on her. She was left with absolutely nothing. 6 months later, the early morning mist rolled gently off the surface of the lake, dissolving into the crisp autumn air. The heavy, suffocating tension that had gripped my life was entirely gone, replaced by the rhythmic, soothing lapping of water against the wooden pylons of the dock. I sat in a weathered canvas folding chair holding a steaming mug of black coffee. Beside me, my granddaughter Layla stood at the edge of the cedar planks, gripping a small, brightly colored fishing rod with absolute fierce determination. "I got a bite. "Grandpa!" she squealed, her face lighting up with a brilliant, unburdened smile. She reeled the line in, frantically pulling a tiny, thrashing sunfish out of the water. "That is a monster catch, sweetie," I said, chuckling as I set my mug down to help her unhook it. We gently tossed the fish back into the lake, watching it dart away into the dark blue depths. Layla laughed, a pure, ringing sound that echoed across the water. Hearing that laughter free from the shadow of Courtney's manufactured hostility and Kendall's cowardly silence was the ultimate validation of everything I had done. She was safe. She was thriving in her second-grade class, making real friends, and living in a house where love was not conditional on financial leverage. I sat back in my chair and looked up at the lake house behind us. The sturdy cedar-shingled cabin stood exactly as Naomi and I had built it decades ago. It was not a luxury boutique. It was not collateral for a fraudulent loan. It was a home. It was the very structure Courtney had demanded on that fateful Sunday morning, the catalyst that had forced me to bring their entire fake empire crashing down to the ground. Sitting there in the profound peace of the morning, I took a moment to reflect on the wreckage we had left behind. Courtney was currently wearing an oversized orange jumpsuit, her days reduced to hauling wet laundry in a humid federal basement, entirely abandoned by the wealthy parents and elite friends she had sacrificed her freedom to impress. Kendall was locked away in a minimum security facility, forced to finally confront the reality of his own weakness, without the safety net of my bank account to catch his fall. I did not feel like a conquering general standing over a battlefield. There was no arrogant triumph in my heart. As an engineer, I knew the truth about structural failure. When a building becomes infected with black mold or compromised by a rotting foundation, you do not win a war against the decay. You simply execute a calculated, localized demolition. You violently excise the cancer, tearing out the toxic drywall and the shattered support beams to save the healthy parts of the house that are still capable of standing strong. I had amputated the diseased branches of my family tree so Layla could have the sunlight she needed to grow. The sun climbed higher over the tree line, casting a warm golden glow across the rippling surface of the lake. Layla rested her fishing rod against the railing and climbed up onto my lap, wrapping her small arms securely around my neck. I held her close, resting my chin against the top of her head. The world around us was perfectly, beautifully still. I looked out over this vast, calm expanse of the water, feeling the weight of the last 6 months finally lift from my shoulders. I thought about the sheer arrogance of the people who had tried to destroy me. They had looked at a quiet, compliant older man and assumed they saw a weak, easy victim. They thought an old man's silence was surrender. They forgot that before the hurricane rips the foundation from the earth, the sky is always terrifyingly quiet. True family is never defined by a shared last name, but by the presence of mutual respect and unwavering loyalty. We often confuse obligation with love, blindly financing the lives of those who view our generosity as a weakness to be exploited. Blood does not give anyone the right to strip away your dignity or drain your precious legacy. The most vital truth I learned is that protecting your peace requires absolute boundaries. You cannot heal a toxic environment by sacrificing yourself. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, leave a comment below, and share it with your friends today.